Book 1. Chapter 1. Dusk of a summer night, and the tall walls of the commercial heart of an American city of perhaps 400,000 inhabitants, such walls as in time may linger as a mere fable, and up the broad street, now comparatively hushed, a little band of 6, a man of about 50, short, stout, with bushy hair protruding from under a round black felt hat, a most unimportant-looking person, who carried a small portable organ, such as is customarily used by street preachers and singers, and with him a woman perhaps 5 years his junior, taller, not so broad, but solid of frame and vigorous, very plain in face and dress, and yet not homely, leading with one hand a small boy of 7, and in the other carrying a Bible and several hymn books. With these 3, but walking independently behind, was a girl of 15, a boy of 12, and another girl of 9, all following obediently, but not too enthusiastically in the wake of the others. It was hot, yet with a sweet languor about it all. Crossing at right angles the great thoroughfare on which they walked was a second canyon-like way, threaded by throngs and vehicles and various lines of cars, which clanged their bells and made such progress as they might amid swiftly moving streams of traffic. Yet the little group seemed unconscious of anything save a set purpose to make its way between the contending lines of traffic and pedestrians which rode by them. Having reached an intersection this side of the second principal thoroughfare, really just an alley between 2 tall structures, now quite bare of life of any kind, the man put down the organ, which the woman immediately opened, setting up a music rack upon which she placed a wide flat hymn book. Then, handing the Bible to the man, she fell back in line with him, while the 12-year-old boy put down a small camp stool in front of the organ. The man, the father as he chanced to be, looked about him with seeming wide-eyed assurance, and announced, without appearing to care whether he had any auditors or not, "We will first sing a hymn of praise, so that any who may wish to acknowledge the Lord may join us. Will you oblige, Hester?" At this the eldest girl, who until now had attempted to appear as unconscious and unaffected as possible, bestowed her rather slim and as yet undeveloped figure upon the camp chair, and turned the leaves of the hymn book, pumping the organ while her mother observed, "I should think it might be nice to sing 27 tonight. How sweet the balm of Jesus' love." By this time various homeward-bound individuals of diverse grades and walks of life, noticing the small group disposing itself in this fashion, hesitated for a moment to eye them askance, or pause to ascertain the character of their work. This hesitancy, construed by the man apparently to constitute attention, however mobile, was seized upon by him, and he began addressing them as though they were specifically here to hear him. "Let us all sing 27, then. How sweet the balm of Jesus' love." At this the young girl began to interpret the melody upon the organ, emitting a thin though correct strain, at the same time joining a rather high soprano with that of her mother, together with a rather dubious baritone of the father. The other children piped weakly along, the boy and girl having taken hymn books from the small pile stacked upon the organ. As they sang, this nondescript and indifferent street audience gazed, held by the peculiarity of such an unimportant-looking family publicly raising its collective voice against the vast skepticism and apathy of life. Some were interested or moved sympathetically by the rather tame and inadequate figure of the girl at the organ, others by the impractical and materially inefficient texture of the father, whose weak blue eyes and rather flabby but poorly clothed figure bespoke more of failure than anything else. Of the group, the mother alone stood out as having that force and determination which, however blind or erroneous, makes for self-preservation, if not success in life. She more than any of the others stood up with an ignorant, yet somehow respectable air of conviction. If you'd watched her, her hymn book dropped to her side, her glance directed straight before her into space, you would have said, "Well, here's one, who, whatever her defects, probably does what she believes as nearly as possible." A kind of hard-fighting faith in the wisdom and mercy of that definite overruling and watchful power which she proclaimed was written in her every feature and gesture. "The love of Jesus saves me whole, the love of God my steps control," she sang resonantly, if slightly nasally, between the towering walls of the adjacent buildings. The boy moved restlessly from one foot to the other, keeping his eyes down, and for the most part only half singing. A tall and as yet slight figure, surmounted by an interesting head and face, white skin, dark hair. He seemed more keenly observant and decidedly more sensitive than most of the others, appeared indeed to resent and even to suffer from the position in which he found himself. Plainly pagan rather than religious, life interested him, although as yet he was not fully aware of this. All that could be truly said of him now was that there was no definite appeal in all this for him. He was too young, his mind much too responsive to phases of beauty and pleasure which had little of anything to do with a remote and cloudy romance which swayed the minds of his mother and father. Indeed, the home life of which this boy found himself a part, and the various contacts, material and psychic, which thus far had been his, did not tend to convince him of the reality and force of all that his mother and father seemed so certainly to believe and say. Rather, they seemed more or less troubled in their lives, at least materially. His father was always reading the Bible and speaking and meeting at different places, especially in the mission, which he and his mother conducted not so far from this corner. At the same time, as he understood it, they collected money from various interested or charitably inclined businessmen here and there who appeared to believe in such philanthropic work. Yet the family was always hard up, never very well clothed, and deprived of many comforts and pleasures which seemed common enough to others. And his father and mother were constantly proclaiming the love and mercy and care of God for him and for all. Plainly there was something wrong somewhere. He could not get it all straight, but still he could not help respecting his mother, a woman whose force and earnestness, as well as her sweetness, appealed to him. Despite much mission work and family cares, she managed to be fairly cheerful, or at least sustaining, often declaring most emphatically, "God will provide," or "God will show the way," especially in times of too great stress about food or clothes. Yet, apparently, in spite of this, as he and all the other children could see, God did not show any very clear way, even though there was always an extreme necessity for his favorable intervention in their affairs. Tonight, walking up the great street with his sisters and brother, he wished that they need not do this any more, or at least that he need not be a part of it. Other boys did not do such things, and besides, somehow it seemed shabby and even degrading. On more than one occasion, before he had been taken on the street in this fashion, other boys had called to him and made fun of his father, because he was always publicly emphasizing his religious beliefs or convictions. Thus, in one neighborhood in which they lived, when he was but a child of 7, his father, having always preluded every conversation with "Praise the Lord," he heard boys call, "Here comes old Praise the Lord Griffiths," or they would call out after him, "Hey, you're the fellow whose sister plays the organ. Is there anything else she can play?" "What does he always want to go around saying praise the Lord for? Other people don't do it." It was that old mass yearning for a likeness in all things that troubled them and him. Neither his father nor his mother was like other people, because they were always making so much of religion, and now at last they were making a business of it. On this night in this great street with its cars and crowds and tall buildings, he felt ashamed, dragged out of normal life, to be made a show and jest of. The handsome automobiles that sped by, the loitering pedestrians moving off to what interests and comforts he could only surmise, the gay pairs of young people, laughing and jesting, and the kids staring, all troubled him with a sense of something different, better, more beautiful than his, or rather their life. And now units of this vagrom and unstable street throng, which was forever shifting and changing about them, seemed to sense the psychologic error of all this in so far as these children were concerned, for they would nudge one another, the more sophisticated and indifferent lifting an eyebrow and smiling contemptuously, the more sympathetic or experienced commenting on the useless presence of these children. "I see these people around here nearly every night now, 2 or 3 times a week anyhow." This from a young clerk who just met his girl and was escorting her toward a restaurant. "They're just working some religious dodge or other, I guess. That oldest boy don't want to be here. He feels out of place, I can see that. It ain't right to make a kid like that come out unless he wants to. He can't understand all this stuff anyhow." This from an idler and loafer of about 40, one of those odd hangers-on about the commercial heart of a city, addressing a pausing and seemingly amiable stranger. "Yeah, I guess that's so," the other assented, taking in the peculiar cast of the boy's head and face. In view of the uneasy and self-conscious expression upon the face whenever it was lifted, one might have intelligently suggested that it was a little unkind as well as idle to thus publicly force upon a temperament as yet unfitted to absorb their import religious and psychic services best suited to reflective temperaments of maturer years. Yet so it was. As for the remainder of the family, both the youngest girl and the boy were too small to really understand much of what it was all about, or to care. The eldest girl at the organ appeared not so much to mind as to enjoy the attention and comment her presence and singing evoked, for more than once, not only strangers but her mother and father had assured her that she had an appealing and compelling voice, which was only partially true. It was not a good voice. They did not really understand music. Physically, she was of a pale, emasculate, and unimportant structure, with no real mental force or depth, and was easily made to feel that this was an excellent field in which to distinguish herself and attract a little attention. As for the parents, they were determined upon spiritualizing the world as much as possible, and once the hymn was concluded, the father launched into one of those hackneyed descriptions of the delights of a release, via self-realization of the mercy of God and the love of Christ and the will of God toward sinners, from the burdensome cares of an evil conscience. "All men are sinners in the light of the Lord," he declared, "unless they repent, unless they accept Christ, His love and forgiveness of them, they can never know the happiness of being spiritually whole and clean. Oh, my friends, if you could but know the peace and content that comes with the knowledge, the inward understanding that Christ lived and died for you, and that He walks with you every day and hour, by light and by dark, at dawn and at dusk, to keep and strengthen you for the tasks and cares of the world that are ever before you. Oh, the snares and pitfalls that beset us all, and then the soothing realization that Christ is ever with us, to counsel, to aid, to hearten, to bind up our wounds and make us whole. Oh, the peace, the satisfaction, the comfort, the glory of that." "Amen," asseverated his wife, and the daughter Hester, or Esther, as she was called by the family, moved by the need of as much public support as possible for all of them, echoed it after her. Clyde, the eldest boy, and the two younger children merely gazed at the ground, or occasionally at their father, with a feeling that possibly it was all true and important, yet somehow not as significant or inviting as some of the other things which life held. They heard so much of this, and to their young and eager minds life was made for something more than street and mission hall protestations of this sort. Finally, after a second hymn, and an address by Mrs. Griffiths, during which she took occasion to refer to the mission work jointly conducted by them in a nearby street, and their services to the cause of Christ in general, a third hymn was indulged in, and then some tracts describing the mission rescue work being distributed. Such voluntary gifts as were forthcoming were taken up by Asa, the father. The small organ was closed, the camp chair folded up and given to Clyde, the Bible and hymn books picked up by Mrs. Griffiths, and with the organ supported by a leather strap passed over the shoulder of Griffiths Sr., the missionward march was taken up. During all this time Clyde was saying to himself that he did not wish to do this any more, that he and his parents looked foolish and less than normal. Cheap was the word he would have used, if he could have brought himself to express his full measure of resentment at being compelled to participate in this way, and that he would not do it any more if he could help. What good did it do them to have him along? His life should not be like this. Other boys did not have to do as he did. He meditated now more determinedly than ever a rebellion by which he would rid himself of the need of going out in this way. Let his elder sister go if she chose. She liked it. His younger sister and brother might be too young to care, but he— "They seemed a little more attentive than usual tonight, I thought," commented Griffiths to his wife as they walked along, the seductive quality of the summer evening air softening him into a more generous interpretation of the customary indifferent spirit of the passer-by. "Yes, 27 took tracts tonight, as against 18 on Thursday." "The love of Christ must eventually prevail," comforted the father, as much to hearten himself as his wife. "The pleasures and cares of the world hold a very great many, But when sorrow overtakes them, then some of these seeds will take root. I'm sure of it. That is the thought which always keeps me up. Sorrow and the weight of sin eventually bring some of them to see the error of their way. They now entered into the narrow side street from which they had emerged, and walking as many as a dozen doors from the corner, entered the door of a yellow single-story wooden building. The large window and the 2 glass panes in the central door of which had been painted a gray-white. Across both windows and the smaller panels in the double door had been painted, "The Door of Hope, Bethel Independent Mission, meetings every Wednesday and Saturday night, 8 to 10, Sundays at 11, 3, and 8. Everybody welcome." Under this legend on each window were printed the words, "God is love," and below this again in smaller type, "How long since you wrote to Mother?" The small company entered the yellow, unprepossessing door and disappeared. Chapter 2. That such a family, thus cursorily presented, might have a different and somewhat peculiar history could well be anticipated, and it would be true. Indeed, this one presented one of those anomalies of psychic and social reflex and motivation, such as would tax the skill of not only the psychologist, but the chemist and physicist as well to unravel. To begin with, Asa Griffiths, the father, was one of those poorly integrated and correlated organisms, the product of an environment and a religious theory, but with no guiding or mental insight of his own, yet sensitive and therefore highly emotional, and without any practical sense whatsoever. Indeed, it would be hard to make clear just how life appealed to him, or what the true hue of his emotional responses was. On the other hand, as has been indicated, his wife was of a firmer texture, but with scarcely any truer or more practical insight into anything. The history of this man and his wife is of no particular interest here, save as it affected their boy of 12, Clyde Griffiths. This youth, aside from a certain emotionalism and exotic sense of romance which characterized him, and which he took more from his father than from his mother, brought a more vivid and intelligent imagination to things, and was constantly thinking of how he might better himself if he had a chance, places to which he might go, things he might see, and how differently he might live, if only this, that, and the other things were true. The principal thing that troubled Clyde up to his 15th year, and for long after in retrospect, was that the calling or profession of his parents was the shabby thing that it appeared to be in the eyes of others. For so often throughout his youth in different cities in which his parents had conducted a mission or spoken on the streets, Grand Rapids, Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, lastly Kansas City, it had been obvious that people, at least the boys and girls he encountered, looked down upon him and his brothers and sisters for being the children of such parents. On several occasions, and much against the mood of his parents, who never countenanced such exhibitions of temper, he'd stopped to fight with one or another of these boys. But always beaten or victorious, he'd been conscious of the fact that the work his parents did was not satisfactory to others, shabby, trivial, and always he was thinking of what he would do once he reached the place where he could get away. For Clyde's parents had proved impractical in the matter of the future of their children. They did not understand the importance or the essential necessity for some form of practical or professional training for each and every one of their young ones. Instead, being wrapped up in the notion of evangelizing the world, they had neglected to keep their children in school in any one place. They'd moved here and there, sometimes in the very midst of an advantageous school season, because of a larger and better religious field in which to work. And there were times when, the work proving highly unprofitable, and Asa being unable to make much money at the two things he most understood, gardening and canvassing for one invention or another, they were quite without sufficient food or decent clothes, and the children could not go to school. In the face of such situations as these, whatever the children might think, Asa and his wife remained as optimistic as ever, or they insisted to themselves that they were, and had unwavering faith in the Lord and his intention to provide. The combination home and mission which this family occupied was dreary enough, in most of its phases, to discourage the average youth or girl of any spirit. It consisted in its entirety of one long store floor in an old and decidedly colorless and inartistic wooden building, which was situated in that part of Kansas City which lies north of Independence Boulevard and west of Troost Avenue, the exact street or place being called Bickle, a very short thoroughfare opening off Missouri Avenue, a somewhat more lengthy but no less nondescript highway, and the entire neighborhood in which it stood was very faintly and yet not agreeably redolent of a commercial life which had long since moved farther south, if not west. It was some 5 blocks from the spot on which twice a week the open-air meetings of these religious enthusiasts and proselytizers were held. And it was the ground floor of this building, looking out into Bickle Street, at the front and some dreary backyard of equally dreary frame houses, which was divided at the front into a hall 40 by 25 feet in size, and in which had been placed some 60 collapsible wooden chairs, a lectern, a map of Palestine or the Holy Land, and for wall decorations some 25 printed but unframed mottos which read in part, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help." Psalms 35:2. "And ye, my flock, the flock of my pasture, Amen. And I am your God, saith the Lord God." Ezekiel 34:31. "O God, thou knowest my foolishness, and my sins are not hid from thee." Psalms 69:5. "If ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall move, and nothing shall be impossible to you." Matthew 17:20. "For the day of the Lord is near." Obadiah 15. "For there shall be no reward to the evil man." Proverbs 24:20. "Look then not upon the wine when it is red. It biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder." Proverbs 23:31-32. These mighty adjurations were as silver and gold plates set in a wall of dross. The rear 40 feet of this very commonplace floor was intricately and yet neatly divided into 3 small bedrooms, a living room, which overlooked the backyard and wooden fences of yards no better than those at the back, also a combination kitchen and dining room exactly 10 feet square, and a storeroom for mission tracts, hymnals, boxes, trunks, and whatever else of non-immediate use, but of assumed value, which the family owned. This particular small room lay immediately to the rear of the mission hall itself, and into it before or after speaking, or at such times as a conference seemed important, both Mr. and Mrs. Griffiths were wont to retire, also at times to meditate or pray. How often had Clyde and his sisters and younger brother seen his mother or father, or both, in conference with some derelict or semi-repentant soul, who'd come for advice or aid, most usually for aid, and here at times when his mother's and father's financial difficulties were greatest, they were to be found thinking, or as Asa Griffiths was wont helplessly to say at times, praying their way out, a rather ineffectual way, as Clyde began to think later, and the whole neighborhood was so dreary and run down that he hated the thought of living in it, let alone being part of a work that required constant appeals for aid, as well as constant prayer and thanksgiving to sustain it. Mrs. Elvira Griffiths, before she'd married Asa, had been nothing but an ignorant farm girl, brought up without much thought of religion of any kind. But having fallen in love with him, she'd become inoculated with the virus of evangelism and proselytizing which dominated him, and had followed him gladly and enthusiastically in all of his ventures and through all of his vagaries. Being rather flattered by the knowledge that she could speak and sing, her ability to sway and persuade and control people with the word of God, as she saw it, she had become more or less pleased with herself on this account, and so persuaded to continue. Occasionally a small band of people followed the preachers to their mission, or learning of its existence through their street work, appeared there later. Those odd and mentally disturbed or distrait souls were to be found in every place, and it had been Clyde's compulsory duty throughout the years when he could not act for himself to be in attendance at these various meetings, and always he'd been more irritated than favorably influenced by the types of men and women who came here, mostly men, down-and-out laborers, loafers, drunkards, wastrels, the botched and helpless, who seemed to drift in because they had no other place to go. And they were always testifying as to how God or Christ or divine grace had rescued them from this or that predicament, never how they'd rescued anyone else. And always his father and mother were saying, Amen, and glory to God, and singing hymns and afterward taking up a collection for the legitimate expenses of the hall. Collections which, as he surmised, were little enough, barely enough to keep the various missions they had conducted in existence. The one thing that really interested him in connection with his parents was the existence somewhere in the East, in a small city called Lycurgus, near Utica, he understood, of an uncle, a brother of his father's, who was plainly different from all this. That uncle, Samuel Griffiths by name, was rich. In one way and another, from casual remarks brought by his parents, Clyde had heard references to certain things this particular uncle might do for a person, if he but would. References to the fact that he was a shrewd, hard businessman, that he had a great house and a large factory in Lycurgus, for the manufacture of collars and shirts, which employed not less than 300 people, that he had a son who must be about Clyde's age, and several daughters, two at least, all of whom must be, as Clyde imagined, living in luxury in Lycurgus. News of all this had apparently been brought west in some way by people who knew Asa and his father and brother. As Clyde pictured this uncle, he must be a kind of Croesus, living in ease and luxury there in the East, while here in the West, Kansas City, he and his parents and his brother and sisters were living in the same wretched and humdrum, hand-to-mouth state that had always characterized their lives. But for this, apart from anything he might do for himself, as he early began to see, there was no remedy. For at 15, and even a little earlier, Clyde began to understand that his education, as well as his sisters and brothers, had been sadly neglected, and it would be rather hard for him to overcome this handicap, seeing that other boys and girls with more money and better homes were being trained for special kinds of work. How was one to get a start under such circumstances? Already, when at the age of 13, 14, and 15, he began looking in the papers, which, being too worldly, had never been admitted to his home, he found that mostly skilled help was wanted, or boys to learn trades in which at that moment he was not very much interested. For true to the standard of the American youth, or the general American attitude toward life, he felt himself above the type of labor which was purely manual. What? Run a machine, lay bricks, learn to be a carpenter, or a plasterer, or a plumber, when boys no better than himself were clerks and druggists' assistants, and bookkeepers and assistants in banks, and real estate offices and such? Wasn't it menial, as miserable as the life he had thus far been leading, to wear old clothes and get up so early in the morning, and do all the commonplace things such people had to do? But Clyde was as vain and proud as he was poor. He was one of those interesting individuals who looked upon himself as a thing apart, never quite wholly and indissolubly merged with the family of which he was a member, and never with any profound obligations to those who had been responsible for his coming into the world. On the contrary, he was inclined to study his parents, not too sharply or bitterly, but with a very fair grasp of their qualities and capabilities, and yet with so much judgment in that direction he was never quite able, at least not until he'd reached his 16th year, to formulate any policy in regard to himself, and then only in a rather fumbling and tentative way. Incidentally, by that time the sex lure, or appeal, had begun to manifest itself, and he was already intensely interested and troubled by the beauty of the opposite sex, its attractions for him and his attraction for it. And naturally and coincidentally, the matter of his clothes and his physical appearance had begun to trouble him not a little, how he looked and how other boys looked. It was painful to him now to think that his clothes were not right, that he was not as handsome as he might be, not as interesting. What a wretched thing it was to be born poor, and not to have anyone to do anything for you, and not to be able to do so very much for yourself. Casual examination of himself in mirrors, whenever he found them, tended rather to assure him that he was not so bad-looking. A straight, well-cut nose, high white forehead, wavy, glossy black hair, eyes that were black and rather melancholy at times, and yet the fact that his family was the unhappy thing that it was, that he'd never had any real friends, and could not have any as he saw it, because of the work and connection of his parents, was now tending more and more to induce a kind of mental depression or melancholia which promised not so well for his future. It served to make him rebellious and hence lethargic at times. Because of his parents, and in spite of his looks, which were really agreeable and more appealing than most, he was inclined to misinterpret the interested looks which were cast at him occasionally by young girls in very different walks of life from him, the contemptuous and yet rather inviting way in which they looked to see if you were interested or disinterested, brave or cowardly. And yet, before he'd ever earned any money at all, he had always told himself that if only he had a better collar, a nicer shirt, finer shoes, a good suit, a swell overcoat like some boys had. Oh, the fine clothes, the handsome homes, the watches, rings, pins that some boys sported, the dandies many youths of his years already were. Some parents of boys of his years actually gave them cars of their own to ride in. They were to be seen upon the principal streets of Kansas City, flitting to and fro like flies, and pretty girls with them, and he had nothing, and he never had had. And yet the world was so full of so many things to do. So many people were so happy and so successful. What was he to do? Which way to turn? What one thing to take up and master? Something that would get him somewhere. He could not say. He did not know exactly. And these peculiar parents were in no way sufficiently equipped to advise him. Chapter 3. One of the things that served to darken Clyde's mood just about the time when he was seeking some practical solution for himself, to say nothing of its profoundly disheartening effect on the Griffiths family as a whole, was the fact that his sister Esther, in whom he took no little interest, although they really had very little in common, ran away from home with an actor who happened to be playing in Kansas City and who took a passing fancy for her. The truth in regard to Esther was that in spite of her guarded upbringing and the seeming religious and moral fervor which at times appeared to characterize her, she was just a sensuous, weak girl who did not by any means know yet what she thought. Despite the atmosphere in which she moved, essentially she was not of it. Like the large majority of those who profess and daily repeat the dogmas and creeds of the world, she had come into her practices and imagined attitudes so insensibly from her earliest childhood on that up to this time and even later she did not know the meaning of it all, for the necessity of thought had been obviated by advice and law or revealed truth, and so long as other theories or situations and impulses of an external or even internal character did not arise to clash with these, she was safe enough. Once they did, however, it was a foregone conclusion that her religious notions, not being grounded on any conviction or temperamental bias of her own, were not likely to withstand the shock, so that all the while, and not unlike her brother Clyde, her thoughts as well as her emotions were wandering here and there, to love, to comfort, to things which in the main had little, if anything, to do with any self-abnegating and self-immolating religious theory. Within her was a chemism of dreams, which somehow counteracted all they had to say. Yet she had neither Clyde's force, nor on the other hand his resistance. She was in the main a drifter, with a vague yearning toward pretty dresses, hats, shoes, ribbons, and the like, and superimposed above this the religious theory or notion that she should not be. There were the long bright streets of a morning and afternoon after school or of an evening, the charm of certain girls swinging along together, arms locked, secrets of whispering, or that of boys, clownish, yet revealing, through their bounding ridiculous animality, the force and meaning of that chemistry and urge toward mating which lies back of all youthful thought and action. And in herself, as from time to time she observed lovers or flirtation seekers who lingered at street corners or about doorways, and who looked at her in a longing and seeking way, there was a stirring, a nerve-plasm palpitation that spoke loudly for all the seemingly material things of life, not for the thin pleasantries of heaven. And the glances thrilled her like an invisible ray, for she was pleasing to look at, and was growing more attractive hourly, and the moods in others awakened responsive moods in her, those rearranging chemisms upon which all the morality or immorality of the world is based. And then one day, as she was coming home from school, a youth of that plausible variety known as masher engaged her in conversation, largely because of a look and a mood which seemed to invite it. And there was little to stay her, for she was essentially yielding, if not amorous. Yet so great had been her home drilling as to the need of modesty, circumspection, purity, and the like, that on this occasion at least there was no danger of any immediate lapse. Only this attack once made, others followed, were accepted, were not so quickly fled from, and by degrees these served to break down that wall of reserve which her home training had served to erect. She became secretive, and hid her ways from her parents. Youths occasionally walked and talked with her in spite of herself. They demolished that excessive shyness which had been hers, and which had served to put others aside for a time at least. She wished for other contacts, dreamed of some bright, gay, wonderful love of some kind with someone. Finally, after a slow but vigorous internal growth of mood and desire, there came this actor, one of those vain, handsome animal personalities, all clothes and airs, but no morals, no taste, no courtesy, or real tenderness even, but of compelling magnetism, who was able, within the space of one brief week and a few meetings, to completely befuddle and enmesh her, so that she was really his to do with as he wished. And the truth was that he scarcely cared for her at all. To him, dull as he was, she was just another girl, fairly pretty, obviously sensuous and inexperienced, a silly, who could be taken by a few soft words, a show of seemingly sincere affection, talk of the opportunity of a broader, freer life on the road in other great cities, as his wife. And yet his words were those of a lover who would be true forever. All she had to do, as he explained to her, was to come away with him and be his bride at once, now. Delay was so vain when two such as they had met. There was difficulty about marriage here, which he could not explain. It related to friends, but in St. Louis he had a preacher friend who would wed them. She was to have new and better clothes than she'd ever known, delicious adventures, love. She would travel with him and see the great world. She would never need to trouble more about anything save him. And while it was truth to her, the verbal surety of a genuine passion, to him it was the most ancient and serviceable type of blarney, often used before and often successful. In a single week, then, at odd hours, morning, afternoon, and night, this chemic witchery was accomplished. Coming home rather late one Saturday night in April from a walk which he'd taken about the business heart, in order to escape the regular Saturday night mission services, Clyde found his mother and father worried about the whereabouts of Esther. She'd played and sung as usual at this meeting, and all had seemed all right with her. After the meeting she'd gone to her room, saying that she was not feeling very well and was going to bed early. But by 11 o'clock, when Clyde returned, her mother chanced to look into her room, and discovered that she was not there nor anywhere about the place. A certain bareness in connection with the room, some trinkets and dresses removed, an old and familiar suitcase gone, had first attracted her mother's attention. Then the house search proving that she was not there, Ace had gone outside to look up and down the street. She sometimes walked out alone, or sat or stood in front of the mission during its idle or closed hours. This search revealing nothing, Clyde and he had walked to a corner, then along Missouri Avenue. No Esther. At 12 they returned, and after that, naturally, the curiosity in regard to her grew momentarily sharper. At first they assumed that she might have taken an unexplained walk somewhere, but as 12:30 and finally 1 and 1:30 passed and no Esther, they were about to notify the police, when Clyde, going into her room, saw a note pinned to the pillow of her small wooden bed, a missive that had escaped the eye of his mother. At once he went to it, curious and comprehending, for he had often wondered in what way, assuming that he ever wished to depart surreptitiously, he would notify his parents, for he knew they would never countenance his departure unless they were permitted to supervise it in every detail. And now here was Esther missing, and here was undoubtedly some such communication as he might have left. He picked it up, eager to read it, but at that moment his mother came into the room, and seeing it in his hand exclaimed, "What's that? A note? Is it from her?" He surrendered it, and she unfolded it, reading it quickly. He noted that her strong, broad face, always tanned a reddish-brown, blanched as she turned away toward the outer room. Her biggish mouth was now set in a firm, straight line. Her large, strong hand shook the least bit as it held the small note aloft. "Asa!" she called, and then tramping into the next room, where he was, his frizzled grayish hair curling distractedly above his round head, she said, "Read this." Clyde, who had followed, saw him take it a little nervously in his pudgy hands, his lips always weak and beginning to crinkle at the center, with age, now working curiously. Anyone who had known his life's history would have said it was the expression, slightly emphasized, with which he had received most of the untoward blows of his life in the past. "Tst, tst, tst," was the only sound he made at first, a sucking sound of the tongue and palate. most weak and inadequate, it seemed to Clyde. Next there was another tst, 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 his head beginning to shake from side to side. Then, now, what do you suppose could have caused her to do that? Then he turned and gazed at his wife, who gazed blankly in return. Then, walking to and fro, his hands behind him, his short legs taking unconscious and queerly long steps, his head moving again, he gave vent to another ineffectual tst, tst, tst. Always the more impressive, Mrs. Griffiths now showed herself markedly different and more vital in this trying situation, a kind of irritation or dissatisfaction with life itself, along with an obvious physical distress, seeming to pass through her like a visible shadow. Once her husband had gotten up, she reached out and took the note, then merely glared at it again, her face set in hard yet stricken and disturbing lines. Her manner was that of one who is intensely disquieted and dissatisfied, one who fingers savagely at a material knot, and yet cannot undo it, one who seeks restraint and freedom from complaint, and yet who would complain bitterly, angrily, for behind her were all those years of religious work and faith, which somehow in her poorly integrated conscience seemed dimly to indicate that she should justly have been spared this. Where was her God, her Christ, at this hour when this obvious evil was being done? Why had he not acted for her? How was he to explain this? His biblical promises, his perpetual guidance, his declared mercies. In the face of so great a calamity, it was very hard for her, as Clyde could see, to get this straightened out, instantly at least, although, as Clyde had come to know, it could be done eventually, of course. For in some blind, dualistic way both she and Asa insisted, as do all religionists, in disassociating God from harm and error and misery, while granting him nevertheless supreme control. They would seek for something else, some malign, treacherous, deceiving power, which, in the face of God's omniscience and omnipotence, still beguiles and betrays, and find it eventually in the error and perverseness of the human heart, which God has made, yet which he does not control, because he does not want to control it. At the moment, however, only hurt and rage were with her, and yet her lips did not twitch as did Asa's, nor did her eyes show that profound distress which filled his. Instead, she retreated a step, and re-examined the letter, almost angrily, then said to Asa, "She's run away with someone, and she doesn't say—" Then she stopped suddenly, remembering the presence of the children, Clyde, Julia, and Frank, all present, and all gazing curiously, intently, unbelievingly. "Come in here," she called to her husband. "I want to talk to you a minute. You children had better go on to bed. We'll be out in a minute." With Asa, then she retired quite precipitately to a small room back of the mission hall. They heard her click the electric bulb. Then their voices were heard in low converse, while Clyde, Julia, and Frank looked at each other, although Frank, being so young, only 10, could scarcely be said to have comprehended fully. Even Julia hardly gathered the full import of it, but Clyde, because of his larger contact with life and his mother's statement, "She's run away with someone," understood well enough. Esther had tired of all this, as had he. Perhaps there was someone, like one of those dandies whom he saw on the streets with the prettiest girls, with whom she'd gone. But where? And what was he like? That note told something, and yet his mother had not let him see it. She'd taken it away too quickly. If only he'd looked first, silently, and to himself. "Do you suppose she's run away for good?" he asked Julia dubiously, the while his parents were out of the room, Julia herself looking so blank and strange. "How should I know?" she replied a little irritably, troubled by her parents' distress and this secretiveness, as well as Esther's action. "She never said anything to me. I should think she'd be ashamed of herself if she has." Julia, being colder emotionally than either Esther or Clyde, was more considerate of her parents in a conventional way, and hence sorrier. True, she did not quite gather what it meant, but she suspected something, for she talked occasionally with girls, but in a very guarded and conservative way. Now, however, it was more the way in which Esther had chosen to leave, deserting her parents and her brothers and herself, that caused her to be angry with her. But why should she go and do anything which would distress her parents in this dreadful fashion? It was dreadful. The air was thick with misery. And as his parents talked in their little room, Clyde brooded too, for he was intensely curious about life now. What was it Esther had really done? Was it, as he feared and thought, one of those dreadful runaway or sexually disagreeable affairs which the boys on the streets and the school were always slyly talking about? How shameful if that were true! She might never come back. She'd gone with some man. There was something wrong about that, no doubt for a girl anyhow. For all he'd ever heard was that all decent contacts between boys and girls, men and women, led to but one thing, marriage. And now Esther, in addition to their other troubles, had gone and done this. Certainly this home life of theirs was pretty dark now, and it would be darker instead of brighter because of this. Presently the parents came out, and then Mrs. Griffiths' face, if still set and constrained, was somehow a little different, less savage perhaps, more hopelessly resigned. "Esther's seen fit to leave us for a little while anyhow," was all she said at first, seeing the children waiting curiously. "Now you're not to worry about her at all, or think any more about it. She'll come back after a while, I'm sure. She's chosen to go her own way for a time for some reason. The Lord's will be done." "Blessed be the name of the Lord," interpolated Asa. "I thought she was happy here with us, but apparently she wasn't. She must see something of the world for herself, I suppose." Here Asa put in another tst, tst, tst. "But we mustn't harbor hard thoughts. That won't do any good now. Only thoughts of love and kindness." Yet she said this with a kind of sternness that somehow belied it, a click of the voice, as it were. "We can only hope that she will soon see how foolish she's been, and unthinking, and come back. She can't prosper on the course she's going now. It isn't the Lord's way or will. She's too young, and she's made a mistake. But we can forgive her. We must. Our hearts must be kept open, soft, and tender." She talked as though she were addressing a meeting, but with a hard, sad, frozen face and voice. "Now, all of you go to bed. We can only pray now and hope morning, noon, and night that no evil will befall her. I wish she hadn't done that," she added, quite out of keeping with the rest of her statement, and really not thinking of the children as present at all, just of Esther. But Asa, such a father as Clyde often thought afterwards. Apart from his own misery, he seemed only to note and be impressed by the more significant misery of his wife. During all this, he'd stood foolishly to one side, short, grey, frizzled, inadequate. "Well, blessed be the name of the Lord," he interpolated from time to time. "We must keep our hearts open. Yes, we mustn't judge. We must only hope for the best. Yes, yes, praise the Lord. We must praise the Lord. Amen. Oh, yes." End of cassette number 1, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 1, side 2 of An American Tragedy. "If anyone asks where she is," continued Mrs. Griffiths, after a time, quite ignoring her spouse and addressing the children, who had drawn nearer, "we will say that she's gone on a visit to some of my relatives back in Tonawanda. That won't be the truth exactly, but then we don't know where she is or what the truth is, and she may come back. So we must not say or do anything that will injure her until we know." "Yes, praise the Lord," called Asa feebly. "So if anyone should inquire at any time, until we know, we will say that." "Sure," put in Clyde helpfully, and Julia added, "All right." Mrs. Griffiths paused and looked firmly and yet apologetically at her children. Asa, for his part, emitted another tsk-tsk-tsk, and then the children were waved to bed. At that, Clyde, who really wanted to know what Esther's letter had said, but was convinced from long experience that his mother would not let him know unless she chose, returned to his room again, for he was tired. Why didn't they search more if there was hope of finding her? Where was she now, at this minute? On some train somewhere? Evidently she didn't want to be found. She was probably dissatisfied, just as he was. Here he was, thinking so recently of going away somewhere himself, wondering how the family would take it, and now she'd gone before him. How would that affect his point of view and action in the future? Truly, in spite of his father's and mother's misery, he could not see that her going was such a calamity, not from the going point of view at any rate. It was only another something which hinted that things were not right here. Mission work was nothing. All this religious emotion and talk was not so much either. It hadn't saved Esther. Evidently, like himself, she didn't believe so much in it either. Chapter 4. The effect of this particular conclusion was to cause Clyde to think harder than ever about himself, and the principal result of his thinking was that he must do something for himself, and soon. Up to this time, the best he'd been able to do was to work at such odd jobs as befall all boys between their 12th and 15th years, assisting a man who had a paper route during the summer months of one year, working in the basement of a 5 and 10 cent store all one summer long, and on Saturdays, for a period during the winter, opening boxes and unpacking goods, for which he received the munificent sum of $5 a week, a sum which at the time seemed almost a fortune. He felt himself rich, and in the face of the opposition of his parents, who were opposed to the theater and motion pictures also, as being not only worldly but sinful, he could occasionally go to one or another of those in the gallery, a form of diversion which he had to conceal from his parents. Yet that did not deter him. He felt that he had a right to go with his own money, also to take his younger brother Frank, who was glad enough to go with him and say nothing. Later in the same year, wishing to get out of school because he already felt himself very much belated in the race, he secured a place as an assistant to a soda-water clerk in one of the cheaper drugstores of the city, which adjoined a theater, and enjoyed not a little patronage of this sort. A sign, "Boy Wanted," since it was directly on his way to school, first interested him. Later in the conversation with the young man whose assistant he was to be, and from whom he was to learn the trade, assuming that he was sufficiently willing and facile, he gathered that if he mastered this art, he might make as much as $15 and even $18 a week. It was rumored that Stroud's at the corner of 14th and Baltimore Streets paid that much to 2 of their clerks. The particular store to which he was applying paid only $12, the standard salary of most places. But to acquire this art, as he was now informed, required time and the friendly help of an expert. If he wished to come here and work for $5 to begin with, well, $6 then, since his face fell, he might soon expect to know a great deal about the art of mixing sweet drinks and decorating a large variety of ice creams with liquid sweets, thus turning them into sundaes. For the time being, apprenticeship meant washing and polishing all the machinery and implements of this particular counter, to say nothing of opening and sweeping out the store at so early an hour as 7:30, dusting and delivering such orders as the owner of this drugstore chose to send out by him. At such idle moments as his immediate superior, a Mr. Seiberling, 20, dashing, self-confident, talkative, was too busy to fill all the orders, he might be called upon to mix such minor drinks, lemonades, Coca-Colas, and the like, as the trade demanded. Yet this interesting position, after due consultation with his mother, he decided to take. For one thing, it would provide him, as he suspected, with all the ice-cream sodas he desired, free, an advantage not to be disregarded. In the next place, as he saw it at the time, it was an open door to a trade, something which he lacked. Further, and not at all disadvantageously as he saw it, this store required his presence at night as late as 12 o'clock, with certain hours off during the day to compensate for this. And this took him out of his home at night, out of the 10 o'clock boy class at last. They could not ask him to attend any meeting save on Sunday, and not even then, since he was supposed to work Sunday afternoons and evenings. Next, the clerk who manipulated this particular soda fountain quite regularly received passes from the manager of the theater next door, and into the lobby of which one door to the drugstore gave, a most fascinating connection to Clyde. It seemed so interesting to be working for a drugstore, thus intimately connected with a theater. And best of all, as Clyde now found to his pleasure, and yet despair at times, the place was visited, just before and after the show on matinee days, by bevies of girls, single and all sweet, who sat at the counter and giggled and chattered, and gave their hair and their complexions last perfecting touches before the mirror. And Clyde, callow and inexperienced in the ways of the world, and those of the opposite sex, was never weary of observing the beauty, the daring, the self-sufficiency, and the sweetness of these, as he saw them. For the first time in his life, while he busied himself with washing glasses, filling the ice cream and syrup containers, arranging the lemons and oranges in the trays, he had an almost uninterrupted opportunity of studying these girls at close range. The wonder of them! For the most part they were so well dressed and smart-looking. The rings, pins, furs, delightful hats, pretty shoes they wore. And so often he overheard them discussing such interesting things. Parties, dances, dinners, the shows they'd seen, the places in or near Kansas City to which they were soon going, the difference between the styles of this year and last, the fascination of certain actors and actresses, principally actors, who were now playing or soon coming to the city. And to this day in his own home he'd heard nothing of all this. And very often one or another of these young beauties was accompanied by some male in evening suit, dress shirt, high hat, bow tie, white kid gloves, and patent leather shoes, a costume which at that time Clyde felt to be the last word in all true distinction, beauty, gallantry, and bliss. To be able to wear such a suit with such ease and air, to be able to talk to a girl after the manner and with the sang-froid of some of these gallants, what a true measure of achievement! No good-looking girl, as it then appeared to him, would have anything to do with him if he did not possess this standard of equipment. It was plainly necessary, the thing, and once he did attain it, was able to wear such clothes as these, well, then was he not well set upon the path that leads to all the blisses? All the joys of life would then most certainly be spread before him. The friendly smiles, the secret hand-clasps, maybe, an arm about the waist of someone or other, a kiss, a promise of marriage, and then, and all this as a revealing flash after all the years of walking through the streets with his father and mother to public prayer meeting, the sitting in chapel and listening to queer and nondescript individuals, depressing and disconcerting people, telling how Christ had saved them and what God had done for them. You bet he would get out of that now. He would work and save his money and be somebody. Decidedly this simple and yet idyllic compound of the commonplace had all the luster and wonder of a spiritual transfiguration, the true mirage of the lost and thirsting and seeking victim of the desert. However, the trouble with this particular position, as time speedily proved, was that much as it might teach him of mixing drinks, and how to eventually earn $12 a week, it was no immediate solvent for the yearnings and ambitions that were already gnawing at his vitals. For Albert Seiberling, his immediate superior, was determined to keep as much of his knowledge, as well as the most pleasant parts of the tasks, to himself. And further, he was quite at one with the druggist for whom they worked in thinking that Clyde, in addition to assisting him about the fountain, should run such errands as the druggist desired, which kept Clyde industriously employed for nearly all the hours he was on duty. Consequently, there was no immediate result to all this. Clyde could see no way to dressing better than he did. Worse, he was haunted by the fact that he had very little money and very few contacts and connections, so few that, outside his own home, he was lonely, and not so very much less than lonely there. The flight of Esther had thrown a chill over the religious work there, and because as yet she had not returned, the family, as he now heard, was thinking of breaking up here and moving, for want of a better idea, to Denver, Colorado. But Clyde by now was convinced that he did not wish to accompany them. What was the good of it, he asked himself? There would be just another mission there, the same as this one. He'd always lived at home, in the rooms at the rear of the mission in Bickle Street, but he hated it, and since his 11th year, during all of which time his family had been residing in Kansas City, he had been ashamed to bring boy friends to or near it. For that reason he'd always avoided boy friends, and had walked and played very much alone, or with his brother and sisters. But now that he was 16 and old enough to make his own way, he ought to be getting out of this, and yet he was earning almost nothing, not enough to live on if he were alone, and he had not as yet developed sufficient skill or courage to get anything better. Nevertheless, when his parents began to talk of moving to Denver, and suggested that he might secure work out there, never assuming for a moment that he would not want to go, he began to throw out hints to the effect that it might be better if he did not. He liked Kansas City. What was the use of changing? He had a job now, and he might get something better. But his parents, bethinking themselves of Esther and the fate that had overtaken her, were not a little dubious as to the outcome of such early adventuring on his part alone. Once they were away, where would he live? With whom? What sort of influence would enter his life? Who would be at hand to aid and counsel and guide him in the straight and narrow path as they had done? It was something to think about. But spurred by this imminence of Denver, which now daily seemed to be drawing nearer, and the fact that not long after this Mr. Seiberling, owing to his too obvious gallantries in connection with the fair sex, lost his place in the drugstore, and Clyde came by a new and bony and chill superior who did not seem to want him as an assistant, he decided to quit. Not at once, but rather to see, on such errands as took him out of the store, if he could not find something else. Incidentally, in so doing, looking here and there, he one day thought he would speak to the manager of the fountain which was connected with the leading drugstore in the principal hotel of the city, the latter a great 12-story affair, which represented, as he saw it, the quintessence of luxury and ease. Its windows were always so heavily curtained. The main entrance, he'd never ventured to look beyond that, was a splendiferous combination of a glass and iron awning, coupled with a marble corridor lined with palms. Often he had passed here, wondering with boyish curiosity what the nature of the life of such a place might be. Before its doors, so many taxis and automobiles were always in waiting. Today, being driven by the necessity of doing something for himself, he entered the drugstore which occupied the principal corner facing 14th Street at Baltimore, and finding a girl cashier in a small glass cage near the door, asked of her who was in charge of the soda fountain. Interested by his tentative and uncertain manner, as well as his deep and rather appealing eyes, and instinctively judging that he was looking for something to do, she observed, "Why, Mr. Secker, there, the manager of the store." She nodded in the direction of a short, meticulously dressed man of about 35, who was arranging an especial display of toilet novelties on the top of a glass case. Clyde approached him, and being still very dubious as to how one went about getting anything in life, and finding him engrossed in what he was doing, stood first on one foot and then on the other, until at last, sensing someone was hovering about for something, the man turned. "Well?" he queried. "You don't happen to need a soda fountain helper, do you?" Clyde cast at him a glance that said as plain as anything could, "If you have any such place, I wish you'd please give it to me. I need it." "No, no, no," replied this individual, who was blond and vigorous and by nature a little irritable and contentious. He was about to turn away, but seeing a flicker of disappointment and depression pass over Clyde's face, he turned and added, "Ever work in a place like this before?" "No place as fine as this. No, sir," replied Clyde, rather fancifully moved by all that was about him. "I'm working now down at Mr. Klinkle's store at 7th and Brooklyn, but it isn't anything like this one, and I'd like to get something better if I could." Went on his interviewer, rather pleased by the innocent tribute to the superiority of his store. "Well, that's reasonable enough, but there isn't anything here right now that I could offer you. We don't make many changes, but if you'd like to be a bellboy, I can tell you where you might get a place. They're looking for an extra boy in the hotel inside there right now. The captain of the boys was telling me he was in need of one. I should think that would be as good as helping about a soda fountain any day." Then, seeing Clyde's face suddenly brighten, he added, "But you mustn't say that I sent you, because I don't know you. Just ask for Mr. Squires inside there under the stairs, and he can tell you all about it." At the mere mention of work in connection with so imposing an institution as the Green Davidson, and the possibility of his getting it, Clyde first stared, felt himself tremble the least bit with excitement, then, thanking his adviser for his kindness, went direct to a green marble doorway which opened from the rear of this drugstore into the lobby of the hotel. Once through it, he beheld a lobby, the like of which for all his years, but because of the timorous poverty that had restrained him from exploring such a world, was more arresting quite than anything he'd seen before. It was all so lavish. Under his feet was a checkered black and white marble floor, above him a coppered and stained and gilded ceiling, and supporting this a veritable forest of black marble columns as highly polished as the floor, glassy smooth, and between the columns, which ranged away toward 3 separate entrances, one right, one left, and one directly forward toward Dalrymple Avenue, were lamps, statuary, rugs, palms, chairs, divans, tete-a-tetes, a prodigal display. In short, it was compact. Of all that gauche luxury of appointment, which, as someone once sarcastically remarked, was intended to supply exclusiveness to the masses. Indeed, for an essential hotel in a great and successful American commercial city, it was almost too luxurious. Its rooms and hall and lobbies and restaurants were entirely too richly furnished, without the saving grace of either simplicity or necessity. As Clyde stood gazing about the lobby, he saw a large company of people, some women and children, but principally men, as he could see, either walking or standing about and talking or idling in the chairs, side by side or alone, and in heavily draped and richly furnished alcoves, where were writing tables, newspaper files, a telegraph office, a haberdasher shop, and a florist stand, were other groups. There was a convention of dentists in the city, not a few of whom, with their wives and children, were gathered here. But to Clyde, who was not aware of this nor of the methods and meanings of conventions, this was the ordinary, everyday appearance of this hotel. He gazed about in awe and amazement. Then, remembering the name of Squires, he began to look for him in his office under the stairs. To his right was a grand, double-winged black-and-white staircase, which swung in two separate flights, and with wide, generous curves, from the main floor to the one above. And between these great flights was evidently the office of the hotel, for there were many clerks there. But behind the nearest flight, and close to the wall through which he had come, was a tall desk at which stood a young man of about his own age, in a maroon uniform bright with many brass buttons, and on his head was a small round pillbox cap, which was cocked jauntily over one ear. He was busy making entries with a lead pencil in a book which lay open before him. Various other boys about his own age, and uniformed as he was, were seated upon a long bench near him, or were to be seen darting here and there sometimes, returning to this one with a slip of paper, or a key or note of some kind, and then seating themselves upon the bench to await another call, apparently, which seemed to come swiftly enough. A telephone upon the small desk at which stood the uniformed youth was almost constantly buzzing, and after ascertaining what was wanted, this youth struck a small bell before him, or called, "Front!" to which the first boy on the bench responded. Once called, they went hurrying up one or the other stairs, or toward one of the several entrances or elevators, and almost invariably were to be seen escorting individuals whose bags and suitcases and overcoats and golf sticks they carried. There were others who disappeared and returned, carrying drinks on trays, or some package or other, which they were taking to one of the rooms above. Plainly, this was the work that he should be called upon to do, assuming that he would be so fortunate as to connect himself with such an institution as this, and it was all so brisk and enlivening that he wished that he might be so fortunate as to secure a position here. But would he be? And where was Mr. Squires? He approached the youth at the small desk. "Do you know where I'll find Mr. Squires?" he asked. "Here he comes now," replied the youth, looking up and examining Clyde with keen grey eyes. Clyde gazed in the direction indicated, and saw approaching a brisk and dapper and decidedly sophisticated-looking person of perhaps 29 or 30 years of age. He was so very slender, keen, hatchet-faced, and well-dressed that Clyde was not only impressed but overawed at once. A very shrewd and cunning-looking person. His nose was so long and thin, his eyes so sharp, his lips thin and chin pointed. "Did you see that tall, grey-haired man with a Scotch plaid shawl who went through here just now?" he paused to say to his assistant at the desk. The assistant nodded. "Well, they tell me that's the Earl of Landril. He just came in this morning with 14 trunks and 4 servants. Can you beat it? He's somebody in Scotland. That isn't the name he travels under, though, I hear. He's registered as Mr. Blunt. Can you beat that English stuff? They certainly lay on the class, eh?" "You said it," replied his assistant deferentially. He turned for the first time, glimpsing Clyde, but paying no attention to him. His assistant came to Clyde's aid. "That young fellow there's waiting to see you," he explained. "You want to see me?" queried the captain of the bellhops, turning to Clyde, and observing his none-too-good clothes, at the same time making a comprehensive study of him. "The gentleman in the drug-store," began Clyde, who did not quite like the looks of the man before him, but was determined to present himself as agreeably as possible, was saying, that is, he said that I might ask you if there was any chance here for me as a bellboy. I'm working now at Clinkle's drugstore at 7th and Brooklyn as a helper, but I'd like to get out of that, and he said you might. That is, he thought that you had a place open now. Clyde was so flustered and disturbed by the cool, examining eyes of the man before him that he could scarcely get his breath properly, and swallowed hard. For the first time in his life it occurred to him that if he wanted to get on, he ought to insinuate himself into the good graces of people, to do or say something that would make them like him. So now he contrived an eager, ingratiating smile, which he bestowed on Mr. Squires, and added, "If you'd like to give me a chance, I'd try very hard, and I'd be very willing." The man before him merely looked at him coldly, but being the soul of craft and self-acquisitiveness in a petty way, and rather liking anybody who had the skill and the will to be diplomatic, he now put aside an impulse to shake his head negatively and observed, "But you haven't had any training in this work." "No, sir. But couldn't I pick it up pretty quick if I tried hard?" "Well, let me see," observed the head of the bellhops, scratching his head dubiously. "I haven't any time to talk to you now. Come around Monday afternoon. I'll see you then." He turned on his heel and walked away. Clyde, left alone in this fashion, and not knowing just what it meant, stared, wondering. Was it really true that he'd been invited to come back on Monday? Could it be possible that... He turned and hurried out, thrilling from head to toe. The idea! He'd asked this man for a place in the very finest hotel in Kansas City, and he'd asked him to come back and see him on Monday. Gee, what would that mean? Could it be possible that he'd be admitted to such a grand world as this, and that so speedily? Could it really be? Chapter 5. The imaginative flights of Clyde in connection with all this, his dreams of what it might mean for him to be connected with so glorious an institution, can only be suggested, for his ideas of luxury were in the main so extreme and mistaken and gauche, mere wanderings of a repressed and unsatisfied fancy, which as yet had had nothing but imaginings to feed it. He went back to his old duties at the drugstore, to his home after hours in order to eat and sleep, but now for the balance of this Friday and Saturday and Sunday and Monday until late in the day, he walked on air, really. His mind was not on what he was doing, and several times his superior at the drugstore had to remind him to wake up. And after hours, instead of going directly home, he walked north to the corner of 14th and Baltimore, where stood this great hotel, and looked at it. There at midnight even, before each of the 3 principal entrances, one facing each of 3 streets, was a doorman in a long maroon coat, with many buttons and a high-rimmed and long-visored maroon cap. And inside, behind looped and fluted French silk curtains, were the still-blazing lights, the à la carte dining-room, and the American grill in the basement near one corner still open, and about them were many taxis and cars, and there was music always, from somewhere. After surveying it all this Friday night and again on Saturday and Sunday morning, he returned on Monday afternoon at the suggestion of Mr. Squires, and was greeted by that individual rather crustily, for by then he had all but forgotten him. But seeing that at the moment he was actually in need of help, and being satisfied that Clyde might be of service, he led him into a small office under the stair, where, with a very superior manner and much actual indifference, he proceeded to question him as to his parentage, where he lived, at what he'd worked before and where, what his father did for a living. A poser, that, for Clyde, for he was proud and so ashamed to admit that his parents conducted a mission and preached on the streets. Instead, he replied, which was true at times, that his father canvassed for a washing machine and wringer company, and on Sundays preached a religious revelation, which was not at all displeasing to this master of boys, who were inclined to be anything but home-loving and conservative. Could he bring a reference from where he now was? He could. Mr. Squires proceeded to explain that this hotel was very strict. Too many boys, on account of the scenes on the show here, the contact made with undue luxury to which they were not accustomed, though these were not the words used by Mr. Squires, were inclined to lose their heads and go wrong. He was constantly being forced to discharge boys who, because they made a little extra money, didn't know how to conduct themselves. He must have boys who were willing, civil, prompt, courteous to everybody. They must be clean and neat about their persons and clothes, and show up promptly, on the dot, and in good condition for the work every day. And any boy who got to thinking that because he made a little money he could flirt with anybody or talk back or go off on parties at night and then not show up on time or too tired to be quick and bright, needn't think that he would be here long. He would be fired and that promptly. He would not tolerate any nonsense. That must be understood now, once and for all. Clyde nodded assent often and interpolated a few eager "Yes, sirs," and "No, sirs," and assured him at the last that it was the furthest thing from his thoughts and temperament to dream of any such high crimes and misdemeanors as he'd outlined. Mr. Squires then proceeded to explain that this hotel only paid $15 a month and board, at the servants' table in the basement, to any bellboy at any time. But, and this information came as a most amazing revelation to Clyde, every guest for whom any of those boys did anything, carried a bag, or delivered a pitcher of water, or did anything, gave him a tip, and often quite a liberal one, a dime, 15 cents, a quarter, sometimes more. And these tips, as Mr. Squires explained, taken all together, averaged from about $4 to $6 a day, not less and sometimes more. Most amazing pay, as Clyde now realized. His heart gave an enormous bound, and was near to suffocating him at the mere mention of so large a sum. From $4 to $6! Why, that was $28 to $42 a week. He could scarcely believe it, and that in addition to the $15 a month and board. And there was no charge, as Mr. Squires now explained, for the handsome uniforms the boys wore. But it might not be worn or taken out of the place. His hours, as Mr. Squires now proceeded to explain, would be as follows. On Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays he was to work from 6 in the morning until noon, and then with 6 hours off, from 6 in the evening until midnight. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays he need only work from noon until 6, thus giving him each alternate afternoon or evening to himself. But all his meals were to be taken outside his working hours, and he was to report promptly in uniform for line-up and inspection by his superior exactly 10 minutes before the regular hours of his work began at each watch. As for some other things which were in his mind at the time, Mr. Squires said nothing. There were others, as he knew, who would speak for him. Instead he went on to add, and then quite climatically for Clyde at that time, who had been sitting as one in a daze, "I suppose you're ready to go to work now, aren't you?" "Yes, sir. Yes, sir," he replied. "Very good." Then he got up and opened the door which had shut them in. "Oscar," he called to a boy seated at the head of the bellboy bench, to which a tallish, rather oversized youth in a tight, neat-looking uniform responded with alacrity. "Take this young man here, Clyde Griffiths is your name, isn't it, up to the wardrobe on the 12th, and see if Jacobs can find a suit to fit. But if he can't, tell him to alter it by tomorrow. I think the one Silsby wore ought to be about right for him." Then he turned to his assistant at the desk, who was at the moment looking on. "I'm giving him a trial, anyhow," he commented. "Have one of the boys coach him a little tonight, or whenever he starts in. Go ahead, Oscar," he called to the boy in charge of Clyde. "He's green at this stuff, but I think he'll do," he added to his assistant, as Clyde and Oscar disappeared in the direction of one of the elevators. Then he walked off to have Clyde's name entered upon the payroll. In the meantime Clyde, in tow of this new mentor, was listening to a line of information such as never previously had come to his ears anywhere. "You needn't be frightened, if you ain't never worked at anything like this before," began this youth, whose last name was Hegland, as Clyde later learned, and who hailed from Jersey City, New Jersey, exotic lingo, gestures, and all. He was tall, vigorous, sandy-haired, freckled, genial, and voluble. They'd entered upon an elevator labeled employees. "It ain't so hard. I got my first job in Buffalo 3 years ago, and I never knowed a thing about it up to that time. All you gotta do is to watch the others and see how they do, see? You get that, do you?" Clyde, whose education was not a little superior to that of his guide, commented quite sharply, in his own mind, on the use of such words as knowed and gotta, also upon ting and dat, udders, and so on. But so grateful was he for any courtesy at this time that he was inclined to forgive his obviously kindly mentor anything for his geniality. Watch whoever's doing anything as first, see, till you get to know, see? That's the way. When the bell rings, if you're at the head of the bench, it's your turn, see? And you jump up and go quick. They like you to be quick around here, see? And whenever you see anyone come in at the door or out of the elevator with a bag and you're at the head of the bench, you jump, whether the captain rings the bell or calls front or not. Sometimes he's busy or ain't looking, and he wants you to do that, see? Look sharp, because if you don't get no bags, you don't get no tips, see? Everybody that has a bag or anything has to have it carried for 'em, unless they won't let you have it, see? And be sure and wait somewhere near the desk for whoever comes in until they sign up for a room. He rattled on as they ascended in the elevator. Most everyone takes a room. Then the clerk'll give you the key, and after that, all you gotta do is to carry up the bags to the room. Then all you gotta do is to turn on the lights in the bathroom and closet, if there is one, so they'll know where they are, see? And then raise the curtains in the daytime, or lower 'em at night, and see if there's towels in the room, so you can tell the maid if there ain't. And then if they don't give you no tip, you gotta go, only most times, unless you draw a stiff, all you gotta do is hang back a little. Make a stall, see? Fumble with the door key or try the transom, see? Then if they're any good, they'll hand you a tip. If they don't, you're out. That's all, see? You can't even look as though you were sore, though. Nothing like that, see? Then you come down, and unless they wants ice water or something, you're through, see? It's back to the bench quick. There ain't much to it. Only you gotta be quick all the time, see? And not let anyone get by you coming or going. That's the main thing. And after they give you your uniform, and you go to work, don't forget to give the captain $1 after every watch before you leave, see? $2 on the day you has 2 watches, and $1 on the day you has 1, see? That's the way it is here. We work together like that, and you gotta do that if you want to hold your job. But that's all. After that, all the rest is yours. Clyde saw. A part of his $24 or $32, as he figured it, was going glimmering apparently. 11 or 12 all told, but what of it? Would there not be 12 or 15 or even more left? And there were his meals and his uniform. Kind heaven! What a realization of paradise! What a consummation of luxury! Mr. Hegland of Jersey City escorted him to the 12th floor, and into a room where they found on guard a wizened and grizzled little old man of doubtful age and temperament, who forthwith outfitted Clyde with a suit that was so near a fit that, without further orders, it was not deemed necessary to alter it. And trying on various caps, there was one that fitted him, a thing that sat most rakishly over one ear, only as Hegland informed him, "You'll have to get that hair of yours cut. Better get it clipped behind, it's too long." And with that Clyde himself had been in mental agreement before he spoke. His hair did not look right in the new cap. He hated it now. And going downstairs and reporting to Mr. Whipple, Mr. Squire's assistant, the latter had said, "Very well, it fits you all right, does it? Well, then you go on here at 6. Report at 5:30, and be here in your uniform at 5:45 for inspection." Whereupon Clyde, being advised by Mr. Hegland to go then and there to get his uniform, and take it to the dressing-room in the basement, and get his locker from the locker-man, he did so, and then hurried most nervously out, first to get a haircut, and afterwards to report to his family on his great luck. He was to be a bellboy in the great Hotel Green Davidson. He was to wear a uniform, and a handsome one. He was to make, but he did not tell his mother at first what he was to make truly, but more than 11 or 12 at first anyhow, he guessed. He could not be sure, for now, all at once, he saw economic independence ahead for himself, if not for his family. And he did not care to complicate it with any claims which a confession as to his real salary would most certainly inspire. But he did say that he was to have his meals free, because that meant eating away from home, which was what he wished. And in addition he was to live and move always in the glorious atmosphere of this hotel, not to have to go home ever before 12, if he did not wish, to have good clothes, interesting company maybe, a good time. Gee! And as he hurried on about his various errands now, it occurred to him as a final and shrewd and delicious thought that he need not go home on such nights as he wished to go to a theater or anything like that. He could just stay downtown and say he had to work. And that with free meals and good clothes. Think of that. The mere thought of all this was so astonishing and entrancing that he could not bring himself to think of it too much. He must wait and see. He must wait and see just how much he would make here in this perfectly marvelous, marvelous realm. Chapter 6. And as conditions stood, the extraordinary economic and social inexperience of the Griffiths, Asa and Elvira, dovetailed all too neatly with his dreams, for neither Asa nor Elvira had the least knowledge of the actual character of the work upon which he was about to enter, scarcely any more than he did, or what it might mean to him morally, imaginatively, financially, or in any other way, for neither of them had ever stopped in a hotel above the 4th class in all their days. Neither one had ever eaten in a restaurant of a class that catered to other than individuals of their own low financial level. If there could be any other forms of work or contact than those involved in carrying the bags of guests to and from the door of a hotel to its office and back again, for a boy of Clyde's years and temperament, never occurred to them, and it was naively assumed by both that the pay for such work must of necessity be very small anywhere, say $5 or $6 a week, and so actually below Clyde's deserts and his years. And in view of this, Mrs. Griffiths, who was more practical than her husband at all times, and who was intensely interested in Clyde's economic welfare as well as that of her other children, was actually wondering why Clyde should of a sudden become so enthusiastic about changing to this new situation, which, according to his own story, involved longer hours and not so very much more pay, if any. To be sure, he had already suggested that it might lead to some superior position in the hotel, some clerkship or other, but he did not know when that would be, and the other had promised rather definite fulfillment somewhat earlier, as to money, anyhow. But seeing him rush in on Monday afternoon and announce that he had secured the place, and that forthwith he must change his tie and collar, and get his hair cut and go back and report, she felt better about it. For never before had she seen him so enthusiastic about anything, and it was something to have him more content with himself, not so moody as he was at times. Yet the hours which he began to maintain now, from 6 in the morning until midnight, with only an occasional early return on such evenings as he chose to come home when he was not working, and when he troubled to explain that he had been let off a little early, together with a certain eager and restless manner, a desire to be out and away from his home at nearly all such moments as he was not in bed or dressing or undressing, puzzled his mother and Asa also. The hotel. The hotel. He must always hurry off to the hotel, and all that he had to report was that he liked it ever so much, and he was doing all right, he thought. It was nicer work than working around a soda fountain, and he might be making more money pretty soon. He couldn't tell. But as for more than that, he either wouldn't or couldn't say. And all the time the Griffiths, father and mother, were feeling that because of the affair in connection with Vesta, they should really be moving away from Kansas City, should go to Denver. And now, more than ever, Clyde was insisting that he did not want to leave Kansas City. They might go, but he had a pretty good job now and wanted to stick to it. And if they left, he could get a room somewhere and would be all right, a thought which did not appeal to them at all. But in the meantime went an enormous change in Clyde's life, beginning with that first evening when at 5:45 he appeared before Mr. Whipple, his immediate superior, and was approved, not only because of the fit of his new uniform, but for his general appearance. The world for him had changed entirely. Lined up with 7 others in the servants' hall, immediately behind the general offices in the lobby, and inspected by Mr. Whipple, the squad of 8 marched at the stroke of 6 through a door that gave into the lobby on the other side of the staircase from where stood Mr. Whipple's desk, then about and in front of the general registration office to the long bench on the other side. Mr. Barnes, who alternated with Mr. Whipple, then took charge of the assistant captain's desk, and the boys seated themselves, Clyde at the foot, only to be called swiftly and in turn to perform this, that, and the other service, while the relief squad of Mr. Whipple was led away into the rear servants' hall as before, where they disbanded. Cling! The bell on the room clerk's desk had sounded, and the first boy was going. Cling! It sounded again, and a second boy leaped to his feet. "Front! Center door!" called Mr. Barnes, and a third boy was skidding down the long marble floor toward that entrance to seize the bags of an incoming guest, whose white whiskers and youthful bright tweed suit were visible to Clyde's uninitiated eyes 100 feet away. A mysterious and yet sacred vision. A tip. "Front!" It was Mr. Barnes calling again. "See what 913 wants. Ice water, I guess." And a fourth boy was gone. Clyde, steadily moving up along the bench and adjoining Headland, who'd been detailed to instruct him a little, was all eyes and ears and nerves. He was so tense that he could hardly breathe, and fidgeted and jerked until finally Headland exclaimed, "Now don't get excited. Just hold your horses, will you? You'll be all right. You're just like I was when I begun, all noise, but that ain't the way. Easy what's you got to be around here, and you wants to look as though you wasn't seeing nobody nowhere, just looking to see what you got before you. Front!" Mr. Barnes again. Clyde was scarcely able to keep his mind on what Headland was saying. 115 wants some writing paper and pens. A fifth boy had gone. Where do you get writing paper and pens if they want 'em? He pleaded of his instructor, as one who was about to die might plead. "Offen the tea desk, I told you. He's to the left over there. He'll give 'em to you, and you gets ice water in the hall we lined up in just a minute ago. And that end over there, see? You'll see a little door. You gotta give that guy in there a dime once in a while, or he'll get sore. Bling!" The room clerk's bell. A sixth boy had gone without a word to supply some order in that direction. "And now remember," continued Headland, seeing that he himself was next, and cautioning him for the last time, "if they wants drinks of any kind, you get 'em in the grill over there off in the dining room, and be sure and get the names of the drinks straight or they'll get sore. And if it's a room you're showing, pull the shades down tonight and turn on the lights. And if it's anything from the dining room you gotta see the head waiter, he gets the tip, see? Front!" He was up and gone, and Clyde was number 1, and number 4 was already seating himself again by his side, but looking shrewdly around to see if anybody was wanted anywhere. "Front!" It was Mr. Barnes. Clyde was up and before him, grateful that it was no one coming in with bags, but worried for fear it might be something that he would not understand or could not do quickly. "See what 882 wants." Clyde was off toward one of the 2 elevators marked employees, the proper one to use, he thought, because he'd been taken to the 12th floor that way. But another boy stepping out from one of the fast passenger elevators cautioned him as to his mistake. "Go into a room," he called. "Use the guest elevators. Them's for the servants or anybody with bundles." Clyde hastened to cover his mistake. 8, he called. There being no one else in the elevator with him, the Negro elevator boy in charge of the car saluted him at once. "You's news, ain't you? I ain't seen you around here before." "Yes, I just came on," replied Clyde. "Well, you won't hate it here," commented this youth in the most friendly way. "No one hates this house, I'll say. 8, did you say?" He stopped the car and Clyde stepped out. He was too nervous to think to ask the direction, and now began looking at room numbers, only to decide after a moment that he was in the wrong corridor. The soft brown carpet under his feet, the soft cream-tinted walls, the snow-white bowl light set in the ceiling, all seemed to him parts of a perfection and a social superiority which was almost unbelievable, so remote from all that he'd ever known. And finally, finding 882, he knocked timidly, and was greeted after a moment by a segment of a very stout and vigorous body in a blue and white striped union suit, and a related segment of a round and florid head in which was set one eye and some wrinkles to one side of it. "Here's a $1 bill, son," said the eye seemingly, and now a hand appeared holding a paper dollar. It was fat and red. "You go out to a haberdasher's and get me a pair of garters, Boston garters, silk, and hurry back." "Yes, sir," replied Clyde, and took the dollar. The door closed, and he found himself hustling along the hall toward the elevator, wondering what a haberdasher's was. As old as he was, 17, the name was new to him. He'd never even heard it before, or noticed it at least. If the man had said a gent's furnishing store, he would have understood at once. But now here he was told to go to a haberdasher's, and he didn't know what it was. A cold sweat burst out upon his forehead. His knees trembled. The devil! What would he do now? Could he ask anyone, even Headland, and not seem— He pushed the elevator button, The car began to descend. A haberdasher! A haberdasher! Suddenly a sane thought reached him. Supposing he didn't know what a haberdasher was. After all, the man wanted a pair of silk Boston garters. Where did one get silk Boston garters? At a store, of course, a place where they sold things for men. Certainly, a gents' furnishing store. He would run out to a store, and on the way down, noting another friendly Negro in charge, he asked, "Do you know if there's a gents' furnishing store anywhere around here?" "One in the building, Captain, right outside the south lobby," replied the Negro, and Clyde hurried there greatly relieved. Yet he felt odd and strange in his close-fitting uniform and his peculiar hat. All the time he was troubled by the notion that his small, round, tight-fitting hat might fall off. And he kept pressing it furtively and yet firmly down. This book is continued on cassette number 2, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape. An American Tragedy, continuing on cassette number 2, side 1. Bustling into the haberdasher's, which was blazing with lights outside, Clyde exclaimed, "I want to get a pair of Boston silk garters." "All right, son, here you are," replied a sleek, short man with bright bald head, pink face, and gold-rimmed glasses. "For someone in the hotel, I presume? Well, we'll make that 75 cents, and here's a dime for you," he remarked, as he wrapped up the package and dropped the dollar in the cash register. "I always like to do the right thing by you boys in there, because I know you come to me whenever you can." Clyde took the dime and the package, not knowing quite what to think. The garters must be 75 cents, he said so. Hence only 25 cents need be returned to the man. Then the dime was his, and now maybe would the man really give him another tip? He hurried back into the hotel and up to the elevators. The strains of a string orchestra somewhere were filling the lobby with delightful sounds. People were moving here and there, so well dressed, so much at ease, so very different from most of the people in the streets or anywhere as he saw it. An elevator door flew open, various guests entered, then Clyde and another bellboy who gave him an interested glance. At the 6th floor the boy departed. At the 8th, Clyde and an old lady stepped forth. He hurried to the door of his guest and tapped. The man opened it, somewhat more fully dressed than before. He had on a pair of trousers and was shaving. "Back, eh?" he called. "Yes, sir," replied Clyde, handing him the package and change. "He said it was 75 cents. "He's a damned robber, but you can keep the change just the same," he replied, handing him the quarter and closing the door. Clyde stood there quite spellbound for the fraction of a second. 35 cents, he thought. 35 cents. And for one little short errand. Could that really be the way things went here? It couldn't be, really. It wasn't possible, not always. And then, his feet sinking in the soft nap of the carpet, his hand in one pocket clutching the money, he felt as if he could squeal or laugh out loud. Why, 35 cents, and for a little service like that. This man had given him a quarter and the other a dime, and he hadn't done anything at all. He hurried from the car at the bottom. The strains of the orchestra once more fascinated him, the wonder of so well-dressed a throng thrilling him, and made his way to the bench from which he had first departed. And following this, he'd been called to carry the 3 bags and 2 umbrellas of an aged farmer-like couple who had engaged a parlor, bedroom, and bath on the 5th floor. En route they kept looking at him, as he could see, but said nothing. Yet once in their room, and after he'd promptly turned on the lights near the door, lowered the blinds, and placed the bags upon the bag-racks, the middle-aged and rather awkward husband, a decidedly solemn and bewhiskered person, studied him, and finally observed, "Young fellow, you seem to be a nice, brisk sort of boy. Rather better than most we've seen so far, I must say." "I certainly don't think that hotels are any place for boys," chirped up the wife of his bosom, a large and rotund person, who by this time was busily employed inspecting an adjoining room. "I certainly wouldn't want any of my boys to work in 'em, the way people act." "But here, young man," went on the elder, laying off his overcoat and fishing in his trousers pocket, "you go down and get me 3 or 4 evening papers, if there are that many, and a pitcher of ice water, and I'll give you 15 cents when you get back." "This hotel's better than the one in Omaha, Pa," added the wife sententiously. "It's got nicer carpets and curtains." and as green as Clyde was, he could not help smiling secretly. Openly, however, he preserved a mask-like solemnity, seemingly effacing all facial evidence of thought, and took the change and went out. And in a few moments he was back with the ice water and all the evening papers, and departed smilingly with his 15 cents. But this in itself was but a beginning in so far as this particular evening was concerned, for he was scarcely seated upon the bench again before he was called to room 529, only to be sent to the bar for drinks, 2 ginger ales and 2 siphons of soda, and this by a group of smartly dressed young men and girls who were laughing and chattering in the room, one of whom opened the door just wide enough to instruct him as to what was wanted. But because of a mirror over the mantel, he could see the party and one pretty girl in a white suit and cap sitting on the edge of a chair in which reclined a young man who had his arm about her. Clyde stared, even while pretending not to, and in this state of mind, this sight was like looking through the gates of paradise. Here were young fellows and girls in this room, not so much older than himself, laughing and talking and drinking even, not ice-cream sodas and the like, but such drinks, no doubt, as his mother and father were always speaking against as leading to destruction, and apparently nothing was thought of it. He bustled down to the bar, and having secured the drinks and a charge slip, returned, and was paid $1.50 for the drinks and a quarter for himself. Once more he had a glimpse of the appealing scene, only now one of the couples was dancing to a tune sung and whistled by the other 2. But what interested him as much as the visits to and glimpses of individuals in the different rooms was the moving panorama of the main lobby, the character of the clerks behind the main desk, room clerk, key clerk, mail clerk, cashier and assistant cashier, and the various stands about the place, flower stand, news stand, cigar stand, telegraph office, taxicab office, and all manned by individuals who seemed to him curiously filled with the atmosphere of this place. And then around and between all these, walking or sitting, were such imposing men and women, young men and girls, all so fashionably dressed, all so ruddy and contented-looking, and the cars or other vehicles in which some of them appeared about dinner-time and later, it was possible for him to see them in the flare of the lights outside, the wraps, furs, and other belongings in which they appeared, or which were often carried by these other boys and himself across the great lobby and into the cars or the dining-room, or the several elevators, and they were always of such gorgeous textures, as Clyde saw them, such grandeur. This, then, most certainly was what it meant to be rich, to be a person of consequence in the world, to have money. It meant that you did what you pleased, that other people like himself waited upon you, that you possessed all of these luxuries, that you went how, where, and when you pleased. Chapter 7. And so, of all the influences which might have come to Clyde at this time, either as an aid or an injury to his development, perhaps the most dangerous for him, considering his temperament, was this same Green Davidson, than which no more materially affected or gaudy a realm could have been found anywhere between the 2 great American mountain ranges. Its darkened and cushioned tea-room, so somber and yet tinted so gaily with colored lights, was an ideal rendezvous, not only for such inexperienced and eager flappers of the period who were to be taken by a show of luxury, but also for those more experienced and perhaps a little faded beauties who had a thought for their complexions and the advantages of dim and uncertain lights. Also, like most hotels of its kind, it was frequented by a certain type of eager and ambitious male of not certain age or station in life, who counted upon his appearance here at least once, if not twice a day, at certain brisk and interesting hours, to establish for himself the reputation of man about town, or rounder, or man of wealth, or taste, or attractiveness, or all. It was not long after Clyde had begun to work here that he was informed by these peculiar boys with whom he was associated, one or more of whom was constantly seated with him upon the hop bench, as they called it, as to the evidence and presence even here. It was not long before various examples of the phenomena were pointed out to him, of a certain type of social pervert, morally disarranged and socially taboo, who sought to arrest and interest boys of their type in order to come into some form of illicit relationship with them, which at first Clyde could not grasp. The mere thought of it made him ill, and yet some of these boys, as he was now informed, a certain youth in particular, who was not on the same watch with him at this time, was supposed to be of the mind that fell for it, as one of the other youths phrased it. And the talk and the palaver that went on in the lobby and the grill, to say nothing of the restaurants and rooms, were sufficient to convince any inexperienced and none too discerning mind that the chief business of life for anyone with a little money or social position was to attend a theater, a ball game in season, or to dance, motor, entertain friends at dinner, or to travel to New York, Europe, Chicago, California. And there had been in the lives of most of these boys such a lack of anything that approached comfort or taste, let alone luxury, that not unlike Clyde, they were inclined to not only exaggerate the import of all that they saw, but to see in this sudden transition an opportunity to partake of it all. Who were these people with money, and what had they done that they should enjoy so much luxury, where others as good seemingly as themselves had nothing? And wherein did these latter differ so greatly from the successful? Clyde could not see. Yet these thoughts flashed through the minds of every one of these boys. At the same time, the admiration, to say nothing of the private overtures of a certain type of woman or girl, who, inhibited perhaps by the social milieu in which she found herself, but having means, could invade such a region as this, and by wiles and smiles and the money she possessed, ingratiate herself into the favor of some of the more attractive of these young men here, was much commented upon. Thus a youth named Ratterer, a hall boy here, sitting beside him the very next afternoon, seeing a trim, well-formed blonde woman of about 30 enter with a small dog upon her arm, and much bedecked with furs, first nudged him, and with a faint motion of the head, indicating her vicinity, whispered, "See her? There's a swift one. I'll tell you about her sometime when I've time. Gee, the things she don't do." "What about her?" asked Clyde, keenly curious, for to him she seemed exceedingly beautiful, most fascinating. "Oh, nothing, except she's been in with about 8 different men around here since I've been here. She fell for Doyle," another hall boy, whom by this time Clyde had already observed as being the quintessence of Chesterfieldian grace and airs and looks, a youth to imitate, for a while, but now she's got someone else. "Really?" inquired Clyde, very much astonished and wondering if such luck would ever come to him. "Surest thing you know," went on Ratterer. "She's a bird that way, never gets enough. Her husband, they tell me, has a big lumber business somewhere over in Kansas, but they don't live together no more. She's one of the best suites on the 6th, but she ain't in it half the time, the maid told me." This same Ratterer, who was short and stocky but good-looking and smiling, was so smooth and bland and generally agreeable that Clyde was instantly drawn to him and wished to know him better. And Ratterer reciprocated that feeling, for he had the notion that Clyde was innocent and inexperienced, and that he would like to do some little thing for him if he could. The conversation was interrupted by a service call, and never resumed about this particular woman, but the effect on Clyde was sharp. The woman was pleasing to look upon, and exceedingly well-groomed, her skin clear, her eyes bright. Could what Ratterer had been telling him really be true? She was so pretty. He sat and gazed, a vision of something which he did not care to acknowledge even to himself, tingling the roots of his hair. And then the temperaments and the philosophy of these boys. Kinsella, short and thick and smooth-faced and a little dull, as Clyde saw it, but good-looking and virile, and reported to be a wizard at gambling, who throughout the first 3 days, at such times as other matters were not taking his attention, had been good enough to continue Heglin's instructions in part. He was a more suave, better-spoken youth than Hegland, though not so attractive as Ratterer, Clyde thought, without the latter's sympathetic outlook as Clyde saw it. And again there was Doyle, Eddie, whom Clyde found intensely interesting from the first, and of whom he was not a little jealous, because he was so very good-looking, so trim of figure, easy and graceful of gesture, and with so soft and pleasing a voice. He went about with an indescribable air which seemed to ingratiate him instantly with all whom he came in contact, the clerks behind the counter no less than the strangers who entered and asked this or that question of him. His shoes and collar were so clean and trim, and his hair cut and brushed and oiled after a fashion which would have become a moving picture actor. From the first Clyde was utterly fascinated by his taste in the matter of dress. The neatest of brown suits, caps with ties and socks to match. He should wear a brown velvet coat just like that. He should have a brown cap, and a suit as well cut and attractive. Similarly, a not unrelated and yet different effect was produced by that same youth who had first introduced Clyde to the work here, Hegland, who was one of the older and more experienced bellhops, and of considerable influence with the others because of his genial and devil-may-care attitude toward everything outside the exact line of his hotel duties. Hegland was neither as schooled nor as attractive as some of the others, yet by reason of a most avid and dynamic disposition, plus a liberality where money and pleasure were concerned, and a courage, strength, and daring which neither Doyle nor Ratterer nor Kinsella could match, a strength and daring almost entirely divested of reason at times, he interested and charmed Clyde immensely. As he himself related to Clyde after a time, he was the son of a Swedish journeyman baker, who some years before in Jersey City had deserted his mother and left her to make her way as best she could. In consequence, neither Oscar nor his sister Martha had any too much education or decent social experience of any kind. On the contrary, at the age of 14 he left Jersey City in the boxcar, and had been making his way ever since as best he could. And like Clyde also, he was insanely eager for all the pleasures which he'd imagined he saw swirling around him, and was for prosecuting adventures in every direction, lacking, however, the nervous fear of consequence which characterized Clyde. Also he had a friend, a youth by the name of Sparser, somewhat older than himself, who was chauffeur to a wealthy citizen of Kansas City, and who occasionally managed to purloin a car and so accommodate Hegland in the matter of brief outings here and there, which courtesy, unconventional and dishonest though it might be, still caused Hegland to feel that he was a wonderful fellow and of much more importance than some of these others, and to lend him in their eyes a lustre which had little of the reality which it suggested to them. Not being as attractive as Doyle, it was not so easy for him to win the attention of girls, and those he did succeed in interesting were not of the same charm or import by any means. Yet he was inordinately proud of such contacts as he could effect, and not a little given to boasting in regard to them, a thing which Clyde took with more faith than would most, being of less experience. For this reason Hegland liked Clyde almost from the very first, sensing in him perhaps a pleased and willing auditor. So finding Clyde on the bench beside him from time to time, he had proceeded to continue his instructions. Kansas City was a fine place to be if he knew how to live. He'd worked in other cities, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, before he came here, but he'd not liked any of them any better, principally, which was a fact which he did not trouble to point out at the time, because he'd not done as well in those places as he had here. He'd been a dishwasher, car cleaner, plumber's helper, and several other things before finally, in Buffalo, he'd been inducted into the hotel business. And then a youth working there, but who was now no longer here, had persuaded him to come on to Kansas City. But here, say, the tips in this hotel is as big as you'll get anywhere, I know that. And what's more, there's nice people working here. You do your bit by them, and they'll do right by you. I've been here now over a year, and I ain't got no complaint. That guy Squires is all right if it don't cause him no trouble. He's hard, but he's got to look out for himself, too. That's natural. But he don't fire nobody unless he's got a reason. I know that, too. And as for the rest, there's no trouble. And when your work's true, your time's your own. These fellows here are good sports, all of them. They're no four-flushers and no tightwads either. Whenever there's anything on, a good time or something like that, they're on, nearly all of them. And they don't mooch or grouch in case things don't work out right neither. I know that, because I've been with him now, lots of times. He gave Clyde the impression that these youths were all the best of friends, close, all but Doyle, who was a little standoffish, but not coldly so. He's got too many women chasing him, that's all. And also they went here and there together on occasion, to a dance or a dinner, a certain gambling joint down near the river, a certain pleasure resort, Kate Sweeney's, where were some peaches of girls, and so on and so forth, a world of such information as had never previously been poured into Clyde's ear, and that set him meditating, dreaming, doubting, worrying and questioning as to the wisdom, charm, delight to be found in all this, also the permissibility of it in so far as he was concerned, for had he not been otherwise instructed in regard to all this all his life long? There was a great thrill, and yet a great question involved in all to which he was now listening to attentively. Again there was Thomas Ratterer, who was of a type which at first glance one would have said could scarcely prove either inimical or dangerous to any of the others. He was not more than 5'4", plump, with black hair and olive skin, and with an eye that was as limpid as water and as genial as could be. He, too, as Clyde learned after a time, was of a nondescript family, and so had profited by no social or financial advantages of any kind. But he had a way, and was liked by all of these youths, so much so that he was consulted about nearly everything. A native of Wichita, recently moved to Kansas City, he and his sister were the principal support of a widowed mother. During their earlier and formative years, both had seen their very good-natured and sympathetic mother, of whom they were honestly fond, spurned and abused by a faithless husband. There had been times when they were quite without food. On more than one occasion they had been ejected for non-payment of rent. None too continuously, Tommy and his sister had been maintained in various public schools. Finally, at the age of 14, he had decamped to Kansas City, where he had secured different odd jobs, until he succeeded in connecting himself with a Green Davidson, and was later joined by his mother and sister, who had removed from Wichita to Kansas City to be with him. But even more than by the luxury of the hotel or these youths, whom swiftly and yet surely he was beginning to decipher, Clyde was impressed by the downpour of small change that was tumbling in upon him and making a small lump in his right-hand pants pocket. Dimes, nickels, quarters, and half-dollars even, which increased and increased even on the first day until by 9 o'clock he already had over $4 in his pocket, and by 12, at which hour he went off duty, he had over 6.5, as much as previously he had earned in a week. And of all of this, as he then knew, he need only hand Mr. Squires 1, no more, Eglin had said, and the rest, $5.50 for one evening's interesting, yes, delightful and fascinating work, belonged to himself. He could scarcely believe it. It seemed fantastic, Aladdinish, really. Nevertheless, at 12 exactly of that first day a gong had sounded somewhere, and a shuffle of feet had been heard, and 3 boys had appeared, one to take Barnes's place at the desk, the other 2 to answer calls. And at the command of Barnes, the 8 who were present were ordered to rise, right dress, and march away. And in the hall outside, just as he was leaving, Clyde approached Mr. Squires and handed him $1 in silver. "That's right," Mr. Squires remarked. No more. Then Clyde, along with the others, descended to his locker, changed his clothes, and walked out into the darkened streets, a sense of luck and a sense of responsibility as to future luck so thrilling him as to make him rather tremulous, giddy even. To think that now at last he actually had such a place. To think that he could earn this much every day, maybe. He began to walk toward his home, his first thought being that he must sleep well and so be fit for his duties in the morning. But thinking that he would not need to return to the hotel before 11:30 the next day, he wandered into an all-night beanery to have a cup of coffee and some pie. And now all he was thinking was that he would only need to work from noon until 6, when he should be free until the following morning at 6, and then he would make more money, and a lot of it to spend on himself. Chapter 8. The thing that most interested Clyde at first was how, if at all, he was to keep the major portion of all this money he was making for himself. For ever since he'd been working and earning money, it had been assumed that he would contribute a fair portion of all that he received, at least 3/4 of the smallest salaries he had received up to this time, toward the upkeep of the home. But now, if he announced that he was receiving at least $25 a week and more, and this entirely apart from the salary of $15 a month and board, his parents would assuredly expect him to pay 10 or 12. But so long had he been haunted by the desire to make himself as attractive-looking as any other well-dressed boy that, now that he had the opportunity, he could not resist the temptation to equip himself first and as speedily as possible. Accordingly, he decided to say to his mother that all of the tips he received aggregated no more than $1 a day, and in order to give himself greater freedom of action in the matter of disposing of his spare time, he announced that frequently, in addition to the long hours demanded of him every other day, he was expected to take the place of other boys who were sick or set to doing other things. And also, he explained that the management demanded of all boys that they look well outside as well as inside the hotel. He could not long be seen coming to the hotel in the clothes that he now wore. Mr. Squires, he said, had hinted as much. But as if to soften the blow, One of the boys at the hotel had told him of a place where he could procure quite all the things that he needed on time, and so unsophisticated was his mother in these matters that she believed him. But that was not all. He was now daily in contact with a type of youth who, because of his larger experience for the world, and with the luxuries and vices of such a life as this, had already been inducted into certain forms of libertinism and vice, even which up to this time were entirely foreign to Clyde's knowledge, and set him agape with wonder, and at first with even a timorous distaste. Thus, as Hegland had pointed out, a certain percentage of this group, of which Clyde was now one, made common cause in connection with quite regular adventures which usually followed their monthly pay night. These adventures, according to their moods and their cash at the time, led them usually either to one or two rather famous and not too respectable all-night restaurants. In groups, as he gathered by degrees from hearing them talk, they were pleased to indulge in occasional late showy suppers with drinks, after which they were wont to go to either some flashy dance-hall of the downtown section to pick up a girl, or that, failing as a source of group interest, to visit some notorious, or as they would have deemed it reputed, brothel, very frequently camouflaged as a boarding-house, where for much less than the amount of cash in their possession, they could, as they often boasted, have any girl in the house. And here, of course, because of their known youth, ignorance, liberality, and uniform geniality and good looks, they were made much of, as a rule, being made most welcome by the various madames and girls of these places, who sought, for commercial reasons of course, to interest them to come again. And so starved had been Clyde's life up to this time, and so eager was he for almost any form of pleasure, that from the first he listened with all too eager ears to any account of anything that spelled adventure or pleasure. Not that he approved of these types of adventures. As a matter of fact, at first it offended and depressed him, seeing as he did that it ran counter to all he had heard and been told to believe these many years. Nevertheless, so sharp a change and relief from the dreary and repressed work in which he had been brought up was it, that he could not help thinking of all this with an itch for the variety and colour it seemed to suggest. He listened sympathetically and eagerly, even while at times he was mentally disapproving of what he heard. And seeing him so sympathetic and genial, first one and then another of these youths made overtures to him to go here, there, or the other place, to a show, a restaurant, one of their homes, where a card game might be indulged in by two or three of them, or even to one of the shameless houses, contact with which Clyde at first resolutely refused, and by degrees becoming familiar with Hegland and Ratterer, both of whom he liked very much, and being invited by them to a joy-night supper, a blowout, as they termed it, at Frissell's, he decided to go. "There's going to be another one of our monthly blowouts tomorrow night, Clyde, around at Frissell's," Ratterer had said to him. "Don't you want to come along? You haven't been yet." By this time Clyde, having acclimated himself to this choleric atmosphere, was by no means as dubious as he was at first, for by now, in imitation of Doyle, whom he had studied most carefully and to great advantage, he had outfitted himself with a new brown suit, cap, overcoat, socks, stick-pin, and shoes as near like those of his mentor as possible, and the costume became him well, excellently well, so much so that he was far more attractive than he had ever been in his life, and now not only his parents, but his younger brother and sister were not a little astonished and even amazed by the change. How could Clyde have come by all this grandeur so speedily? How much could all this that he wore now have cost? Was he not hypothecating more of his future earnings for this temporary grandeur than was really wise? He might need it in the future. The other children needed things too. And was the moral and spiritual atmosphere of a place that made him work such long hours and kept him out so late every day and for so little pay just the place to work? To all of which he had replied rather artfully for him, that it was all for the best. He was not working too hard. His clothes were not too fine by any means. His mother should see some of the other boys. He was not spending too much money. And anyhow, he had a long while in which to pay for all he'd bought. But now as to this supper, this was a different matter even to him. How, he asked himself, in case the thing lasted until very late as was expected, could he explain to his mother and father his remaining out so very late? Ratterer had said it might last until 3 or 4 anyhow, although he might go, of course, any time. But how would that look, deserting the crowd? And yet, hang it all, most of them did not live at home as he did, or if they did, like Ratterer, they had parents who didn't mind what they did. Still, a late supper like that, was it wise? All these boys drank and thought nothing of it. Hegland, Ratterer, Kinsella, Shield. It must be silly for him to think that there was so much danger in drinking a little, as they did on these occasions. On the other hand, it was true that he need not drink unless he wanted to. He could go, and if anything was said at home, he would say that he had to work late. What difference did it make if he stayed out late once in a while? Wasn't he a man now? Wasn't he making more money than anyone else in the family? And couldn't he begin to do as he pleased? He began to sense the delight of personal freedom, to sniff the air of personal and delicious romance, and he was not to be held back by any suggestion which his mother could now make. Chapter 9. And so the interesting dinner, with Clyde attending, came to pass, and it was partaken of at Frissel's, as Ratterer had said, and by now Clyde, having come to be on genial terms with all of these youths, was in the gayest of moods about it all. Think of his new state in life, anyhow. Only a few weeks ago he was all alone, not a boyfriend, scarcely a boy acquaintance in the world, and here he was, so soon after, going to this fine dinner with this interesting group. And, true to the illusions of youth, the place appeared far more interesting than it really was. It was little more than an excellent chop-house of the older American order. Its walls were hung thick with signed pictures of actors and actresses, together with playbills of various periods. And because of the general excellence of the food, to say nothing of the geniality of its present manager, it had become the hangout of passing actors, politicians, local businessmen, and after them, the generality of followers who are always drawn by that which presents something a little different to that with which they are familiar. And these boys, having heard at one time and another from cab and taxi drivers that this was one of the best places in town, fixed upon it for their monthly dinners. Single plates of anything cost from 60 cents to $1. Coffee and tea were served in pots only. You could get anything you wanted to drink. To the left of the main room as you went in was a darker and low-ceilinged room with a fireplace, to which only men resorted and sat and smoked and read papers after dinner, and it was for this room that these youths reserved their greatest admiration. Eating here, they somehow felt older, wiser, more important, real men of the world, and Ratterer and Hegland, to whom by now Clyde had become very much attached, as well as most of the others, were satisfied that there was not another place in all Kansas City that was really as good. And so this day, having drawn their pay at noon, and being off at 6 for the night, they gathered outside the hotel at the corner nearest the drugstore at which Clyde had originally applied for work, and were off in a happy, noisy frame of mind. Hegland, Ratterer, Paul Shield, Davis Higby, another youth, Arthur Kinsella, and Clyde. "Did you hear the trick the guy from St. Louis pulled on the main office yesterday?" Hegland inquired of the crowd generally as they started walking. "Wars last Saturday from St. Louis, for a parlor, bedroom, and a bath for himself and wife, and orders flowers put in the room. Jimmy, the key clerk, was just telling me. Then he comes on here and registers himself and his girl, see, as man and wife, and gee, a peach of a looking girl, too. I saw him. Listen, you fellas, can't you? Then on Wednesday, after he's been here 3 days, and they're beginning to wonder about him a little, meals sent to the room and all that, he comes down and says that his wife's got to go back to St. Louis, and that he won't need no suite, just one room, and that they can transfer his trunk and her bags to the new room until train time for her. But the trunk ain't his at all, see, but hers, and she ain't going, don't know nothing about it, but he is. Then he beats it, see, and leaves her and the trunk in the room, and without a bean, see? Now they're holding her in the trunk, and she's crying and wiring friends, and there's hell to pay all around. Can you beat that? And the flowers, too, roses, and 6 different meals in the room and drinks for him, too." "Sure, I know the one you mean," exclaimed Paul Shield. "I took up some drinks myself. I felt there was something phony about that guy. He was too smooth and loud-talking, and he only comes across with a dime at that." "I remember him, too," exclaimed Ratterer. "He sent me down for all the Chicago papers Monday, and only give me a dime. He looked like a bluff to me." "Well, they fell for him up in front, all right." It was Hegland talking. And now they're trying to gouge it out of her. Can you beat it?" "She didn't look to me to be more than 18 or 20 if she's that old," put in Arthur Kinsella, who up to now had said nothing. "Did you see either of 'em, Clyde?" inquired Ratterer, who was inclined to favor and foster Clyde and include him in everything. "No," replied Clyde. "I must have missed those two. I don't remember seeing either of 'em." "Well, you missed seeing a bird when you missed that one. Tall, long, black cutaway coat, wide black derby, pulled low over his eyes, pearl grey spats, too. I thought he was an English duke or something at first, the way he walked, and with a cane, too. All they gotta do is pull that English stuff and talk loud and order everybody about, and they get by with it every time." "That's right," commented Davis Higbee. "That's good stuff, that English line. I wouldn't mind pulling some of it myself sometime." They had now turned 2 corners, crossed 2 different streets, and in group formation were making their way through the main door of Frissell's, which gave in on the reflection of lights upon china and silverware and faces, and the buzz and clatter of a dinner crowd. Clyde was enormously impressed. Never before, apart from the Green Davidson, had he been in such a place, and with such wise, experienced youths. They made their way to a group of tables which faced a leather wall seat. The head waiter, recognizing Ratterer and Heglin and Kinsella as old patrons, had 2 tables put together and butter and bread and glasses brought. About these they arranged themselves, Clyde with Ratterer and Higbee occupying the wall seat, Heglin, Kinsella, and Shield sitting opposite. "Now, me for a good old Manhattan to begin with," exclaimed Heglin avidly, looking about on the crowd in the room and feeling that now indeed he was a person. Of a reddish-tan hue, his eyes keen and blue, his reddish-brown hair brushed straight up from his forehead, he seemed not unlike a large and overzealous rooster. And similarly, Arthur Kinsella, once he was in here, seemed to perk up and take heart of his present glory. In a sort of ostentatious way he drew back his coat sleeves, seized a bill of fare, and scanning the drink list on the back, exclaimed, "Well, a dry martini is good enough for a start." "Well, I'm going to begin with a scotch and soda," observed Paul Shields solemnly, examining at the same time the meat orders. "None of your cocktails for me tonight," insisted Ratterer, genially, but with a note of reserve in his voice. "I said I wasn't going to drink much tonight, and I'm not. I think a glass of Rhine wine and seltzer will be about my speed." "For the love of Mike, will you listen to that now?" exclaimed Heglin deprecatingly. "He's going to begin on Rhine wine, and him that likes Manhattans always. What's getting into you all of a sudden, Tommy? I thought you said you wanted a good time tonight." "So I do," replied Ratterer, "but can't I have a good time without lapping up everything in the place? I want to stay sober tonight. No more cold downs for me in the morning, if I know what I'm about. I came pretty near not showing up last time." "That's true, too," exclaimed Arthur Kinsella. "I don't want to drink so much I don't know where I'm at, but I'm not going to begin worrying about it now." "How about you, Higbee?" Heglin now called to the round-eyed youth. "I'm having a Manhattan, too," he replied, and then looking up at the waiter who was beside him, added, "How's tricks, Dennis?" "Oh, I can't complain," replied the waiter. "They're breaking all right for me these days. How's everything over at the hotel?" "Fine, fine," replied Higbee, cheerfully, studying the bill of fare. "And you, Griffiths, what are you going to have?" called Heglin, for his master of ceremonies, delegated by the others to look after the orders and pay the bill and tip the waiter, he was now fulfilling the role. "Who, me? Oh, me!" exclaimed Clyde, not a little disturbed by this inquiry, for up to now, this very hour in fact, he'd never touched anything stronger than coffee or ice-cream soda. He had been not a little taken back by the brisk and sophisticated way in which these youths ordered cocktails and whiskey. Surely he could not go so far as that, and yet so well had he known long before this, from the conversation of these youths, that on such occasions as this they did drink, that he did not see how he could very well hold back. What would they think of him if he didn't drink something? For ever since he'd been among them, he'd been trying to appear as much a man of the world as they were, and yet back of him, as he could plainly feel, lay all of the years in which he'd been drilled in the horrors of drink and evil companionship. And even though in his heart this long while he had secretly rebelled against nearly all the texts and maxims to which his parents were always alluding, deeply resenting really as worthless and pointless the ragamuffin crew of wasters and failures whom they were always seeking to save, still, Now he was inclined to think and hesitate. Should he or should he not drink? For the fraction of an instant only, while all these things in him now spoke, he hesitated, then added, "Why, I think I'll take Rhine wine and seltzer too." It was the easiest and safest thing to say as he saw it. Already the rather temperate and even innocuous character of Rhine wine and seltzer had been emphasized by Hegland and all the others, and yet Ratterer was taking it, a thing which made his choice less conspicuous, and he felt less ridiculous. "Will you listen to this now?" exclaimed Hegland dramatically. "He says he'll have Rhine wine and seltzer too. I see where this party breaks up at 8:30, all right, unless some of the rest of us do something." And Davis Higby, who was far more trenchant and roistering than his pleasant exterior gave any indication of, turned to Ratterer and said, "What do you want to start this Rhine wine and seltzer stuff for so soon, Tom? Don't you want us to have any fun at all tonight?" "Well, I told you why," said Ratterer. "Besides, the last time I went down to that joint, I had $40 when I went in, and not a cent when I came out. I want to know what's going on this time." That joint, thought Clyde on hearing it. Then, after this supper, when they'd all drunk and eaten enough, they were going down to one of those places called a joint, a bad house, really. There was no doubt of it. He knew what the word meant. There would be women there, bad women, evil women, and he would be expected. Could he? Would he? For the first time in his life now, he found himself confronted by a choice as to his desire for the more accurate knowledge of the one great fascinating mystery that had for so long confronted and fascinated and baffled and yet frightened him a little. For despite all his many thoughts in regard to all this and women in general, he had never been in contact with any one of them in this way. And now, all of a sudden he felt faint thrills of hot and cold racing up and down his back and all over him. His hands and face grew hot and then became moist. Then his cheeks and forehead flamed. He could feel them. Strange, swift, enticing, and yet disturbing thoughts raced in and out of his consciousness. His hair tingled, and he saw pictures, bacchanalian scenes, which, swiftly and yet in vain, he sought to put out of his mind. They would keep coming back, and he wanted them to come back, yet he did not, and through it all he was now a little afraid. Pshaw! Had he no courage at all? These other fellows were not disturbed by the prospects of what was before them. They were very gay. They were already beginning to laugh and kid one another in regard to certain funny things that had happened the last time they were all out together. But what would his mother think if she knew? His mother! He dared not think of his mother or his father either at this time, and put them both resolutely out of his mind. "Oh, say, Kinsella," called Higby, "do you remember that little redhead in that Pacific Street joint that wanted you to run away to Chicago with her?" "Do I?" replied the amused Kinsella, taking up the martini that was just then served him. "She even wanted me to quit the hotel game and let her start me in a business of some kind. I wouldn't need to work at all if I stuck by her, she told me." "Oh, no, you wouldn't need to work at all except one way," called Ratterer. The waiter put down Clyde's glass of Rhine wine and seltzer beside him, and, interested and intense and troubled and fascinated by all that he had heard, he picked it up, tasted it, and finding it mild and rather pleasing, drank it all down at once, and yet so wrought up were his thoughts that he scarcely realized then that he had drunk it. "Good for you," observed Kinsella, in a most cordial tone. "You must like that stuff." "Oh, it's not so bad," said Clyde, and Hegland, seeing how swiftly it had gone, and feeling that Clyde, new to this world and green, needed to be cheered and strengthened, called to the waiter, "Here, Jerry, one more of these, and make it a big one," he whispered behind his hand. And so the dinner proceeded, and it was nearly 11 before they had exhausted the various matters of interest to them, stories of past affairs, past jobs, past feats of daring, and by then Clyde had had considerable time to meditate on all of these youths, and he was inclined to think that he was not nearly as green as they thought, or if so, at least shrewder than most of them, of a better mentality, really. For who were they, and what were their ambitions? Hegland, as he could see, was vain and noisy and foolish, a person who could be taken in and conciliated by a little flattery, and Higby and Kinsella, interesting and attractive boys both, were still vain of things he could not be proud of. Higby of knowing a little something about automobiles, He had an uncle in the business, Kinsella of gambling, rolling dice even, and as for Ratter and Shield, he could see and had noticed for some time that they were content with the bellhop business, just continuing in that and nothing more, a thing which he could not believe even now would interest him forever. At the same time, being confronted by this problem of how soon they would be wanting to go to a place into which he had never ventured before, and to be doing things which he never let himself think he would do in just this way, he was just a little disturbed. Had he not better excuse himself after they got outside, or perhaps after starting along with him in whatsoever direction they chose to go, quietly slip away at some corner and return to his own home? Or had he not already heard that the most dreadful of diseases were occasionally contracted in just such places, and that men died miserable deaths later because of low vices begun in this fashion? He could hear his mother lecturing concerning all this, yet with scarcely any direct knowledge of any kind. And yet, as an argument per contra, here were all of these boys in no wise disturbed by what was in their minds or moods to do. On the contrary, they were very gay over it all and amused, nothing more. In fact, Ratterer, who was really very fond of Clyde by now, more because of the way he looked and inquired and listened than because of anything Clyde did or said, kept nudging him with his elbow now and then, asking laughingly, "How about it, Clyde? Going to be initiated tonight?" And then smiling broadly, or finding Clyde quite still and thinking at times, "They won't do more than bite you, Clyde." And Hegland, taking his cue from Ratterer, and occasionally desisting from his own self-glorifying diatribes, would add, "You won't ever be the same, Clyde. They never are. But we'll all be with you in case of trouble." And Clyde, nervous and irritated, would retort, "Ah, cut it out, you two. Quit kidding. What's the use of trying to make out that you know so much more than I do?" And Ratterer would signal Hegland with his eyes to let up, and would occasionally whisper to Clyde, "That's all right, old man. Don't get sore. You know we were just fooling, that's all." And Clyde, very much drawn to Ratterer, would relent, and wish he were not so foolish as to show what he actually was thinking about. At last, however, by 11 o'clock, they had had their fill of conversation and food and drink, and were ready to depart, Hegland leading the way. And instead of the vulgar and secretive mission producing a kind of solemnity and mental or moral self-examination and self-flagellation, they laughed and talked as though there was nothing but a delicious form of amusement before them. Indeed, much to Clyde's disgust and amazement, they now began to reminisce concerning other ventures into this world, of one particular one which seemed to amuse them all greatly, and which seemed to concern some joint, as they called it, which they had once visited, a place called Bettina's. They'd been led there originally by a certain wild youth by the name of Pinky Jones, of the staff of another local hotel, and this boy and one other by the name of Birmingham, together with Hegland, who had become wildly intoxicated, had there indulged in wild pranks which all but led to their arrest, pranks which to Clyde, as he listened to them, seemed scarcely possible to boys of this caliber and cleanly appearance, pranks so crude and disgusting as to sicken him a little. "Oh-ho! And the picture of the water girl on the second floor doused on me as I went out," called Hegland, laughing heartily. "And the big fat guy on the second floor that came to the door to see, remember?" laughed Kinsella. "He thought there was a fire or a riot, I bet. And you and that little fat girl, Piggy. Remember, Ratterer?" squealed Shield, laughing and choking as he tried to tell of it. "And Ratterer's legs all bent under his load. Yoo-hoo!" yelled Hegland. "And the way the two of them finally slid down the steps." "That was all your fault, Hegland," called Higby from Kinsella's side. "If you hadn't tried that switching stuff, we never would have got put out." "I tell you, I was drunk," protested Ratterer. "It was the red-eye they sold in there." End of cassette number 2, side 1. To continue, please turn the cassette over. Cassette number 2, side 2 of An American Tragedy. "And that long, thin guy from Texas with a big mustache. Will you ever forget him, and the way he laughed?" added Kinsella. "He wouldn't help nobody against us, remember? It's a wonder we weren't all thrown in the street or locked up. Oh, gee, what a night!" reminisced Ratterer. By now Clyde was faintly dizzy with the nature of these revelations. Switching. That could mean but one thing. and they expected him to share in revels such as these, maybe. It could not be. He was not that sort of person. What would his mother and father think if they were to hear such dreadful things? And yet, even as they talked, they had reached a certain house in a dark and rather wide street, the curbs of which for a block or more on either side were sprinkled with cabs and cars. And at the corner, only a little distance away, were some young men standing and talking, and over the way more men, and not half a block farther on they passed two policemen idling and conversing. And though there was no light visible in any window, nor over any transom, still, curiously, there was a sense of vivid, radiant life. One could feel it in this dark street. Taxis spun and honked, and two old-time closed carriages still in use rolled here and there, their curtains drawn, and doors slammed or opened and closed, and now and then a segment of bright inward light pierced the outward gloom and then disappeared again. Overhead on this night were many stars. Finally, without any comment from anyone, Hegland, accompanied by Higby and Shield, marched up the steps of this house and rang the bell. Almost instantly the door was opened by a black girl in a red dress. "Good evening. Walk right in, won't you?" was the affable greeting, and the six, having pushed past her and through the curtains of heavy velvet, which separated the small area from the main chambers, Clyde found himself in a bright and rather gaudy general parlor or reception-room, the walls of which were ornamented with gilt-framed pictures of nude or semi-nude girls, and some very high pier mirrors, and the floor was covered by a bright red thick carpet, over which were strewn many gilt chairs. At the back, before some very bright red hangings, was a gilded upright piano, but of guests or inmates there seemed to be none, other than the black girl. "Just be seated, won't you? Make yourselves at home. I'll call the madam." And running upstairs to the left, she began calling, "Oh, Marie, Sadie, Caroline, there's some young gentlemen in the parlor." And at that moment, from a door in the rear, there emerged a tall, slim, and rather pale-faced woman of about 38 or 40, very erect, very executive, very intelligent and graceful-looking, diaphanously and yet modestly garbed, who said with a rather wan and yet encouraging smile, "Oh, hello, Oscar. It's you, is it? And you too, Paul. Hello, Davis. Just make yourselves at home anywhere, all of you. Fanny'll be in a minute. She'll bring you something to drink. I've just hired a new pianist from St. Joe, a Negro. Wait till you hear him. He's awfully clever." She returned to the rear and called, "Oh, Sam!" As she did so, 9 girls of varying ages and looks, but none apparently over 24 or 5, came trooping down the stairs at one side in the rear, and garbed as Clyde had never seen any women dressed anywhere. And they were all laughing and talking as they came, evidently very well pleased with themselves, and in no wise ashamed of their appearance, which in some instances was quite extraordinary as Clyde saw it, their costumes ranging from the gayest and flimsiest of boudoir negligées to the somewhat more sober, if no less revealing, dancing and ballroom gowns. And they were of such varied types and sizes and complexions, slim and stout and medium, tall or short, and dark or light or betwixt, and whatever their ages, all seemed young, and they smiled so warmly and enthusiastically. "Oh, hello, sweetheart, how are you? Don't you want to dance with me? Or, wouldn't you like something to drink?" Chapter 10. Prepared as Clyde was to dislike all this, so steeped had he been in the moods and maxims antipathetic to anything of its kind, still so innately and sensual and romantic was his own disposition, and so starved where sex was concerned, that instead of being sickened, he was quite fascinated. The very fleshly sumptuousness of most of these figures, dull and unromantic as might be the brains that directed them, interested him for the time being. After all, here was beauty of a gross fleshly character, revealed and purchasable, and there were no difficulties of mood or inhibitions to overcome in connection with any of these girls. One of them, a quite pretty brunette in a black and red costume with a band of red ribbon across her forehead, seemed to be decidedly at home with Higby, for already she was dancing with him in the back room to a jazz melody most irrationally hammered out upon the piano. And Ratterer, to Clyde's surprise, was already seated upon one of the gilt chairs, and upon his knees was lounging a tall young girl with very light hair and blue eyes, and she was smoking a cigarette and tapping her gold slippers to the melody of the piano. It was really quite an amazing and Aladdin-like scene to him, and here was Hegland, before whom was standing a German or Scandinavian type, plump and pretty, her arms akimbo and her feet wide apart, and she was asking, with an upward swell of the voice, as Clyde could hear, "You make love to me tonight?" But Hegland, apparently not very much taken with these overtures, calmly shook his head, after which he went on to Kinsella. And even as he was looking and thinking, a quite attractive blonde girl, of not less than 24, but who seemed younger to Clyde, drew up a chair beside him and, seating herself, said, "Don't you dance?" He shook his head nervously. "Want me to show you?" "Oh, I wouldn't want to try here," he said. "Oh, it's easy," she continued. "Come on." But since he would not, though he was rather pleased with her for being agreeable to him, she added, "Well, how about something to drink, then?" "Sure," he agreed gallantly, and forthwith she signaled the young negress who had returned as waitress, and in a moment a small table was put before them, and a bottle of whiskey with soda on the side. A sight that so astonished and troubled Clyde that he could scarcely speak. He had $40 in his pocket, and the cost of drinks here, as he'd heard from the others, would not be less than $2 each, but even so, think of him buying drinks for such a woman at such a price, and his mother and sisters and brother at home, with scarcely the means to make ends meet. And yet he bought and paid for several, feeling all the while that he'd let himself in for a terrifying bit of extravagance, if not an orgy, but now that he was here, he must go through with it. And besides, as he now saw, this girl was really pretty. She had on a delft blue evening gown of velvet, with slippers and stockings to match. In her ears were blue earrings, and her neck and shoulders and arms were plump and smooth. The most disturbing thing about her was that her bodice was cut very low. He dared scarcely look at her there, and her cheeks and lips were painted, most assuredly the marks of the Scarlet Woman. Yet she did not seem very aggressive, in fact quite human, and she kept looking rather interestedly at his deep and dark and nervous eyes. "You work over at the Green Davidson, too, don't you?" she asked. "Yes," replied Clyde, trying to appear as if all this were not new to him, as if he'd often been in just such a place as this amid such scenes. "How did you know?" "Oh, I know Oscar Hegland," she replied. "He comes around here once in a while. Is he a friend of yours?" "Yes. That is, he works over at the hotel with me." "But you haven't been here before." "No," said Clyde swiftly, and yet with a trace of inquiry in his own mood. "Why should she say he hadn't been here before?" "I thought you hadn't. I've seen most of these other boys before, but I never saw you. You haven't been working over at the hotel very long, have you?" "No," said Clyde, a little irritated by this, his eyebrows and the skin of his forehead rising and falling as he talked, a form of contraction and expansion that went on involuntarily whenever he was nervous or thought deeply. "What of it?" "Oh, nothing. I just knew you hadn't. You don't look very much like these other boys. You look different." She smiled oddly and rather ingratiatingly, a smile and a mood which Clyde failed to interpret. "How different?" he inquired, solemnly and contentiously, taking up a glass and drinking from it. "I'll bet you one thing," she went on, ignoring his inquiry entirely. "You don't care for girls like me very much, do you?" "Oh, yes, I do, too," he said evasively. "Oh, no, you don't either, I can tell. But I like you just the same. I like your eyes. You're not like those other fellows. You're more refined, kinda. I can tell. You don't look like them." "Oh, I don't know," replied Clyde, very much pleased and flattered, his forehead wrinkling and clearing as before. This girl was certainly not as bad as he thought, maybe. She was more intelligent, a little more refined than the others. Her costume was not so gross, and she hadn't thrown herself upon him as had these others upon Hegland, Higby, Kinsella, and Ratterer. Nearly all of the group by now were seated upon chairs or divans about the room, and upon their knees were girls, and in front of every couple was a little table with a bottle of whiskey upon it. "Look who's drinking whiskey," called Kinsella, to such of the others as would pay any attention to him, glancing in Clyde's direction. "Well, you needn't be afraid of me," went on the girl, while Clyde glanced at her arms and neck, at her too much revealed bosom, which quite chilled and yet enticed him. "I haven't been so very long in this business, and I wouldn't be here now if it hadn't been for all the bad luck I've had. I'd rather live at home with my family if I could, only they wouldn't have me now." She looked rather solemnly at the floor, thinking mainly of the little inexperienced dunce Clyde was, so raw and green. Also of the money she'd seen him take out of his pocket, plainly quite a sum. Also how really good-looking he was, not handsome or vigorous, but pleasing. And he was thinking at the instant of Esther, as to where she'd gone or was now. What might have befallen her? Who could say? What might have been done to her? Had this girl, by any chance, ever had any such unfortunate experience as she had had? He felt a growing, a somewhat grandiose sympathy, and looked at her as much as to say, "You poor thing." Yet for the moment he would not trust himself to say anything or make any further inquiries. "You fellows who come into a place like this always think so hard of everybody. I know how you are. We're not as bad as you think." Clyde's brows knit and smoothed again. Perhaps she was not as bad as he thought. She was a low woman, no doubt, evil but pretty. In fact, as he looked about the room from time to time, none of the girls appealed to him more, and she thought him better than these other boys, more refined. She detected that. The compliment stuck. Presently she was filling his glass for him and urging him to drink with her. Another group of young men arrived about then, and the other girls coming out of the mysterious portals at the rear to greet them. Eglant and Ratter and Kinsella and Higby, as he saw, mysteriously disappeared up that back stairs that was heavily curtained from the general room. And as these others came in, this girl invited him to come and sit upon a divan in the back room where the lights were dimmer. And now, seated here, she'd drawn very close to him and touched his hands, and finally linking an arm in his and pressing close to him, inquired if he didn't want to see how pretty some of the rooms on the second floor were furnished. And seeing that he was quite alone now, not one of all the group with whom he'd come around to observe him, and that this girl seemed to lean to him warmly and sympathetically, he allowed himself to be led up that curtained back stair and into a small pink and blue furnished room, while he kept saying to himself that this was an outrageous and dangerous proceeding on his part, and that it might well end in misery for him. He might contract some dreadful disease. She might charge him more than he could afford. He was afraid of her, himself, everything really. Quite nervous and almost dumb, with his fears and qualms. And yet he went, and the door locked behind him. This interestingly well-rounded and graceful Venus turned the moment they were within, and held him to her. Then calmly, and before a tall mirror, which revealed her fully to herself and him, began to disrobe. Chapter 11. The effect of this adventure on Clyde was such as might have been expected in connection with one so new and strange to such a world as this. In spite of all that deep and urgent curiosity and desire that had eventually led him to that place and caused him to yield. Still, because of the moral precepts with which he had so long been familiar, and also because of the nervous, ascetic inhibitions which were characteristic of him, he could not but look back upon all this as decidedly degrading and sinful. His parents were probably right when they preached that this was all low and shameful. And yet this whole adventure and the world in which it was laid, once it was all over, was lit with a kind of gross pagan beauty or vulgar charm for him. And until other and more interesting things had partially effaced it, he could not help thinking back upon it with considerable interest and pleasure even. In addition, he kept telling himself that now, having as much money as he was making, he could go and do about as he pleased. He need not go there any more if he did not want to, but he could go to other places that might not be as low, maybe, more refined. He wouldn't want to go with a crowd like that again. He would rather have just one girl somewhere if he could find her, a girl such as those with whom he'd seen Cyberling and Doyle associate. And so, despite all his troublesome thoughts of the night before, he was thus won quickly over to this new source of pleasure, if not its primary setting. He must find a free pagan girl of his own somewhere, if he could, like Doyle, and spend his money on her, and he could scarcely wait until opportunity should provide him with the means of gratifying himself in this way. But more interesting and more to his purpose at the time was the fact that both Hegland and Ratter, in spite of, or possibly because of, a secret sense of superiority which they detected in Clyde, were inclined to look upon him with no little interest, and to court him and to include him among all their thoughts of affairs and pleasures. Indeed, shortly after his first adventure, Ratter invited him to come to his home, where, as Clyde most quickly came to see, was a life very different from his own. At the Griffiths all was so solemn and reserved, the still moods of those who feel the pressure of dogma and conviction. In Ratter's home, The reverse of this was nearly true. The mother and sister with whom he lived, while not without some moral, although no particular religious convictions, were inclined to view life with a great deal of generosity, or as a moralist would have seen it, laxity. There had never been any keen moral or characterful direction there at all, and so it was that Ratter and his sister Louise, who was 2 years younger than himself, now did about as they pleased, and without thinking very much about it. But his sister chanced to be shrewd or individual enough not to wish to cast herself away on just anyone. The interesting part of all this was that Clyde, in spite of a certain strain of refinement, which caused him to look askance at most of this, was still fascinated by the crude picture of life and liberty which it offered. Among such as these, at least, he could go, do, be, as he'd never gone or done or been before. And particularly was he pleased and enlightened, or rather dubiously liberated, in connection with his nervousness and uncertainty in regard to his charm or fascination for girls of his own years. For up to this very time, and in spite of his recent first visit to the erotic temple to which Hegland and the others had led him, he was still convinced that he had no skill with or charm where girls were concerned. Their mere proximity or approach was sufficient to cause him to recede mentally, to chill or palpitate nervously, and to lose what little natural skill he had for conversation or poised banter, such as other youths possessed. But now, in his visits to the home of Ratterer, as he soon discovered, he was to have ample opportunity to test whether this shyness and uncertainty could be overcome, for it was a centre for the friends of Ratterer and his sister, who were more or less of one mood in regard to life. Dancing, card-playing, love-making, rather open and unashamed, went on there. Indeed, up to this time, Clyde could not have imagined that a parent like Mrs. Ratterer could have been as lackadaisical or indifferent as she was, apparently, to conduct and morals generally. He would not have imagined that any mother would have countenanced the easy camaraderie that existed between the sexes in Mrs. Ratterer's home. And very soon, because of several cordial invitations which were extended to him by Ratterer, he found himself part and parcel of this group, a group which, from one point of view, the ideas held by its members, the rather wretched English they spoke, he looked down upon. From another point of view, the freedom they possessed, the zest with which they managed to contrive social activities and exchanges, he was drawn to them, because for the first time these permitted him, if he chose, to have a girl of his own, if only he could summon the courage. And this, owing to the well-meant ministrations of Ratterer and his sister and their friends, he soon sought to accomplish. Indeed, the thing began on the occasion of his first visit to the Ratterers. Louise Ratterer worked in a dry-goods store, and often came home a little late for dinner. On this occasion she did not appear until 7, and the eating of the family meal was postponed accordingly. In the meantime, 2 girl-friends of Louise arrived to consult her in connection with something, and finding her delayed, and Ratterer and Clyde there, they made themselves at home, rather impressed and interested by Clyde and his new finery. For he, at once girl-hungry and girl-shy, held himself nervously aloof, a manifestation which they mistook for a conviction of superiority on his part, and in consequence, arrested by this, they determined to show how really interesting they were, vamp him, no less, and he found their crude briskness and effrontery very appealing, so much so that he was soon taken by the charms of one, a certain Hortense Briggs, who, like Louise, was nothing more than a crude shop-girl in one of the large stores, but pretty and dark and self-appreciative, and yet from the first he realized that she was not a little coarse and vulgar, a very long way removed from the type of girl he'd been imagining in his dreams that he would like to have. "Oh, hasn't she come in yet?" announced Hortense, on first being admitted by Ratterer and seeing Clyde near one of the front windows looking out. "Isn't that too bad? Well, we'll just have to wait a little bit if you don't mind." This last with a switch and a swagger that plainly said, "Who would mind having us around?" And forthwith she began to primp and admire herself before a mirror, which surmounted an ochre-colored mantelpiece that graced a fireless grate in the dining-room. And her friend Greta Miller added, "Oh, dear, yes, I hope you won't make us go before she comes. We didn't come to eat. We thought your dinner would be all over by now." "Where do you get that stuff?" "Put you out," replied Ratterer cynically, "as though anybody could drive you 2 out of here if you didn't want to go. Sit down and play the Victrola or do anything you like. Dinner'll soon be ready, and Louise will be here any minute." He returned to the dining room to look at the paper, which he'd been reading, after pausing to introduce Clyde. And the latter, because of the looks and the airs of these two, felt suddenly as though he'd been cast adrift upon a chartless sea in an open boat. "Oh, don't say eat to me," exclaimed Greta Miller, who was surveying Clyde calmly, as though she were debating with herself whether he was worthwhile game or not, and deciding that he was. "With all the ice cream and cake and pie and sandwiches we'll have to eat yet tonight. We were just going to warn Louise not to fill up too much. Kitty Keen's giving a birthday party, you know, Tom, and she'll have a big cake and everything. You're coming down, ain't you, afterwards?" she concluded, with the thought of Clyde and his possible companionship in mind.
"I wasn't thinking of it," calmly observed Ratterer. "Me and Clyde was thinking of going to a show after dinner."
"Oh, how foolish," put in Hortense Briggs, more to attract attention to herself and take it away from Greta than anything else. She was still in front of the mirror, but turned now to cast a fetching smile on all, particularly Clyde, for whom she fancied her friend might be angling. "When you could come along and dance, I call that silly."
"Sure, dancing is all you three ever think of, you and Louise," retorted Ratterer. "It's a wonder you don't give yourself a rest once in a while. I'm on my feet all day, and I like to sit down once in a while."
He could be most matter-of-fact at times. "Oh, don't say sit down to me," commented Greta Miller with a lofty smile and a gliding, dancing motion of her left foot. "With all the dates we got ahead of us this week. Oh, gee!" Her eyes and eyebrows went up, and she clasped her hands dramatically before her. "It's just terrible, all the dancing we got to do yet this winter, don't we, Hortense? Thursday night and Friday night and Saturday and Sunday nights." She counted on her fingers most archly. "Oh, gee, it's terrible, really." She gave Clyde an appealing, sympathy-seeking smile. "Guess where we were the other night, Tom? Louise and Ralph Thorpe and Hortense and Bert Gettler, me and Willie Bassick, out at Pegrain's on Webster Avenue. Oh, and you ought to seen the crowd out there. Sam Schaffer and Tilly Burns was there, and we danced until 4 in the morning. I thought my knees would break. I ain't been so tired, and I don't know when." "Oh, gee," broke in Hortense, seizing her turn and lifting her arms dramatically. "I thought I would never get to work the next morning. I could just barely see the customers moving around. And wasn't my mother fussy? Gee, she hasn't gotten over it yet. She don't mind so much about Saturdays and Sundays, but all these weeknights, and when I have to get up the next morning at 7, gee, how she can pick." "And I don't blame her either," commented Mrs. Ratterer, who was just then entering with a plate of potatoes and some bread. "You two'll get sick, and Louise too, if you don't get more rest. I keep telling her she won't be able to keep her place or stand it if she don't get more sleep. But she don't pay no more attention to me than Tom does, and that's just none at all."
"Oh, well, you can't expect a fellow in my line to get in early always, Ma," was all Ratterer said.
And Hortense Briggs added, "Gee, I'd die if I had to stay in one night. You gotta have a little fun when you work all day."
What an easy household, thought Clyde. How liberal and indifferent, and the sexy gay way in which these two girls posed about, and their parents thought nothing of it, evidently. If only he could have a girl as pretty as this Hortense Briggs, with her small, sensuous mouth and her bright hard eyes.
"To bed twice a week early's all I need," announced Greta Miller archly. "My father thinks I'm crazy, but more than that would do me harm." She laughed jestingly, and Clyde, in spite of the wee wases and I seens, was most vividly impressed. Here was youth and geniality and freedom and love of life. And just then the front door opened, and in hurried Louise Ratterer, a medium-sized, trim, vigorous little girl, in a red-lined cape and a soft blue felt hat pulled over her eyes. Unlike her brother, she was brisk and vigorous and more lithe, and as pretty as either of these others. "Oh, look who's here!" she exclaimed. "You two birds beat me home, did you? Well, I got stuck tonight on account of some mix-up in my sales book, and I had to go up to the cashier's office. You bet it wasn't my fault, though. They got my writing wrong." Then, noting Clyde for the first time, she announced, "I bet I know who this is. Mr. Griffiths. Tom's talked about you a lot. I wondered why he didn't bring you around here before." And Clyde, very much flattered, mumbled that he wished he had. But the two visitors, after conferring with Louise in a small front bedroom to which they all retired, reappeared presently, and because of strenuous invitations, which were really not needed,
decided to remain, and Clyde, because of their presence, was now intensely wrought up and alert, eager to make a pleasing impression and to be received upon terms of friendship here. And these 3 girls, finding him attractive, were anxious to be agreeable to him, so much so that for the first time in his life they put him at his ease with the opposite sex and caused him to find his tongue. "We were just going to warn you not to eat so much," laughed Greta Miller, turning to Louise. "And now see, we're all trying to eat again." She laughed heartily. "And they'll have pies and cakes and everything at Kitty's. Oh, gee, and we're supposed to dance, too, on top of all this. Well, heaven help me, is all I have to say," put in Hortense. The peculiar sweetness of her mouth as he saw it, as well as the way she crinkled it when she smiled, caused Clyde to be quite beside himself with admiration and pleasure. She looked quite delightful, wonderful to him. Indeed, her effect on him made him swallow quickly and half choke on the coffee he'd just taken. He laughed and felt irrepressibly gay. At that moment she turned on him and said, "See what I've done to him now." "Oh, that ain't all you've done to me," exclaimed Clyde, suddenly being seized with an inspiration and flow of thought and courage. Of a sudden, because of her effect on him, he felt bold and courageous, albeit a little foolish, and added, "Say, I'm getting kind of woozy with all the pretty faces I see around here." "Oh, gee, you don't want to give yourself away that quick around here, Clyde," cautioned Ratterer genially. "These high-binders will be after you to make you take 'em wherever they want to go. You better not begin that way." And sure enough, Louise Ratterer, not to be abashed by what her brother had just said, observed, "You dance, don't you, Mr. Griffiths?" "No, I don't," replied Clyde, suddenly brought back to reality by this inquiry, and regretting most violently the handicap this was likely to prove in this group. "But you bet I wish I did now," he added gallantly, and almost appealingly, looking first at Hortense and then at Greta Miller and Louise. But all pretended not to notice his preference, although Hortense titillated with her triumph. She was not convinced that she was so greatly taken with him, but it was something to triumph thus easily and handsomely over these others, and the others felt it. "Ain't that too bad?" she commented, a little indifferently and superiorly, now that she realized that she was his preference. "You might come along with us, you and Tom, if you did. There's going to be mostly dancing at Kitty's." Clyde began to feel a little crushed at once. To think that this girl, to whom of all those here he was most drawn, could dismiss him and his dreams and desires thus easily, and all because he couldn't dance. And his accursed home training was responsible for all this. He felt broken and cheated. What a boob he must seem not to be able to dance. And Louise Ratterer looked a little puzzled and indifferent, too. But Greta Miller, whom he liked less than Hortense, came to his rescue with, "Oh, it ain't so hard to learn. I could show you in a few minutes after dinner if you wanted to. It's only a few steps you have to know, and then you could go anyhow if you wanted to." Clyde was grateful and said so, determined to learn here or elsewhere at the first opportunity. Why hadn't he gone to a dancing school before this, he asked himself. But the thing that pained him most was the seeming indifference of Hortense now that he'd made it clear that he liked her. Perhaps it was that Bert Gettler, previously mentioned, with whom she'd gone to the dance, who was making it impossible for him to interest her. So he was always to be a failure this way. Oh, gee. But the moment the dinner was over, and while the others were still talking, the first to put on a dance record and come over with hands extended was Hortense, who was determined not to be outdone by her rival in this way. She was not particularly interested or fascinated by Clyde, at least not to the extent of troubling about him as Greta did. But if her friend was going to attempt a conquest in this manner, was it not just as well to forestall her? And so, while Clyde misread her change of attitude to the extent of thinking that she liked him better than he thought, she took him by the hands, thinking at the same time that he was too bashful. However, placing his right arm about her waist, his other clasped in hers at her shoulder, she directed his attention to her feet and his, and began to illustrate the few primary movements of the dance. But so eager and grateful was he, almost intense and ridiculous, she did not like him very much, thought him a little unsophisticated and too young. At the same time there was a charm about him which caused her to wish to assist him, and soon he was moving about with her quite easily, and afterwards with Greta and then Louise, but wishing always it was Hortense. And finally he was pronounced sufficiently skillful to go if he would. And now the thought of being nearer, being able to dance with her again, drew him so greatly that despite the fact that 3 youths, among them that same Bert Gettler, appeared on the scene to escort them, and although he and Ratter had previously agreed to go to a theatre together, he could not help showing how much he would prefer to follow those others, so much so that Ratter finally agreed to abandon the theatre idea. And soon they were off, Clyde grieving that he could not walk with Hortense, who was with Gettler, and hating his rival because of this, but still attempting to be civil to Louise and Greta, who bestowed sufficient attention on him to make him feel at ease. Ratter, having noticed his extreme preference, and being alone with him for a moment, said, "You better not get stuck on that Hortense Briggs. I don't think she's on the level with anybody. She's got that fellow Gettler and others. She'll only work you, and you might not get anything either." But Clyde, in spite of this honest and well-meant caution, was not to be dissuaded. On sight, and because of the witchery of a smile, the magic and vigor of motion and youth, he was completely infatuated, and would have given or done anything for an additional smile or glance or hand pressure. And that despite the fact that he was dealing with a girl who no more knew her own mind than a moth, and who was just reaching the stage where she was finding it convenient and profitable to use boys of her own years or a little older, for whatever pleasures or clothes she desired. The party proved nothing more than one of those ebullitions of the youthful mating period. The house of Kitty Keene was little more than a cottage in a poor street under bare December trees, but to Clyde, because of the passion for a pretty face that was suddenly lit in him, it had the color and the form and gaiety of romance itself, and the young girls and boys that he met there, girls and boys of the Ratterer, Hegland, Hortense stripe, were still of the very substance and texture of that energy, ease, and forwardness which he would have given his soul to possess, and, curiously enough, in spite of a certain nervousness on his part, he was, by reason of his new companions, made an integral part of the gaieties, and on this occasion he was destined to view a type of girl and youth in action, such as previously it had not been his fortune or misfortune, as you will, to see. There was, for instance, a type of sensual dancing which Louise and Hortense and Greta indulged in with the greatest nonchalance and assurance. At the same time, many of these youths carried whiskey in a hip flask, from which they not only drank themselves, but gave others to drink, boys and girls indiscriminately. And the general hilarity for this reason being not a little added to, they fell into more intimate relations, spooning with one another, Hortense and Louise and Greta included, also to quarrelling at times, and it appeared to be nothing out of the ordinary, as Clyde saw, for one youth or another to embrace a girl behind a door, to hold her on his lap in a chair in some secluded corner, to lie with her on a sofa, whispering intimate and unquestionably welcome things to her. And although at no time did he espy Hortense doing this, still as he saw, she did not hesitate to sit on the laps of various boys, or to whisper with rivals behind doors. And this for a time so discouraged and at the same time incensed him, that he felt he could not and would not have anything more to do with her. She was too cheap, vulgar, inconsiderate. At the same time, having partaken of the various drinks offered him, so as not to seem less worldly wise than the others, until brought to a state of courage and daring not ordinarily characteristic of him, he ventured to half plead with, and at the same time half reproach her for her too lax conduct. "You're a flirt, you are. You don't care who you jolly, do you?" This as they were dancing together after 1 o'clock, to the music of a youth named Wilkins, at the none too toneful piano. She was attempting to show him a new step in a genial and yet coquettish way, and with an amused, sensuous look. "What do you mean, flirt? I don't get you." "Oh, don't you?" replied Clyde, a little crossly, and still attempting to conceal his real mood by a deceptive smile. "I've heard about you. You jolly 'em all." "Oh, do I?" she replied quite irritably. "Well, I haven't tried to jolly you very much, have I?" "Well, now, don't get mad," he half pleaded and half scolded, fearing, perhaps, that he had ventured too far and might lose her entirely now. "I don't mean anything by it. You don't deny that you let a lot of these fellows make love to you. They seem to like you, anyway." "Oh, well, of course they like me, I guess. I can't help that, can I?" "Well, I'll tell you one thing," he blurted boastfully and passionately. "I could spend a lot more on you than they could. I got it." He'd been thinking only the moment before of $55 in bills that snuggled comfortably in his pocket. "Oh, I don't know," she retorted. not a little intrigued by this cash offer, as it were, and at the same time not a little set up in her mood by the fact that she could thus inflame nearly all youth in this way. She was really a little silly, very light-headed, who was infatuated by her own charms, and looked in every mirror, admiring her eyes, her hair, her neck, her hands, her figure, and practising a peculiarly fetching smile. At the same time she was not unaffected by the fact that Clyde was not a little attractive to look upon, although so very green. She liked to tease such beginners. He was a bit of a fool as she saw him, but he was connected with a green Davidson, and he was well dressed, and no doubt he had all the money he said and would spend it on her. Some of those whom she liked best did not have much money to spend. Lots of fellows with money would like to spend it on me. She tossed her head and flicked her eyes and repeated her coy smile. At once Clyde's countenance darkened. The witchery of her look was too much for him. The skin of his forehead crinkled and then smoothed out. His eyes burned lustfully and bitterly, his old resentment of life and deprivation showing. No doubt all she said was true. There were others who had more and would spend more. He was boasting and being ridiculous, and she was laughing at him. After a moment he added weakly, "I guess that's right, too. But they couldn't want you more than I do." The uncalculated honesty of it flattered her not a little. It wasn't so bad after all. They were gracefully gliding about as the music continued. "Oh, well, I don't flirt everywhere like I do here. These fellows and girls all know each other. We're always going around together. You mustn't mind what you see here." She was lying artfully, but it was soothing to him none the less. "Gee, I'd give anything if you'd only be nice to me," he pleaded, desperately and yet ecstatically. "I never saw a girl I'd rather have than you. You're swell. I'm crazy about you. Why won't you come out to dinner with me and let me take you to a show afterwards? Don't you want to do that tomorrow night or Sunday? Those are my 2 nights off. I work other nights." She hesitated at first, for even now she was not so sure that she wished to continue this contact. There was Gettler, to say nothing of several others, all jealous and attentive. Even though he spent money on her, she might not wish to bother with him. He was already too eager, and he might become troublesome. At the same time, the natural coquetry of her nature would not permit her to relinquish him. He might fall into the hands of Greta or Louise. In consequence, she finally arranged a meeting for the following Tuesday. But he could not come to the house or take her home tonight, on account of her escort, Mr. Gettler, but on the following Tuesday at 6:30 near the Green Davidson, and he assured her that they would dine first at Frissell's, and then see the Corsair, a musical comedy at Libby's, only 2 blocks away. Chapter 12. Now trivial as this contact may seem to some, it was of the utmost significance to Clyde. Up to this time he had never seen a girl with so much charm who would deign to look at him, or so he imagined, and now he'd found one, and she was pretty and actually interested sufficiently to accompany him to dinner and to a show. It was true, perhaps, that she was a flirt, and not really sincere with anyone, and that maybe at first he could not expect her to center her attentions on him, but who knew? Who could tell? And true to her promise, on the following Tuesday she met him at the corner of 14th Street and Wyandotte, near the Green Davidson, and so excited and flattered and enraptured was he that he could scarcely arrange his jumbled thoughts and emotions in any seemly way. But to show that he was worthy of her, he made an almost exotic toilette, hair pomaded, a butterfly tie, new silk muffler and silk socks to emphasize his bright brown shoes, purchased especially for the occasion. But once he had re-encountered Hortense, whether all this was of any import to her he could not tell, for after all it was her own appearance, not his, that interested her. And what was more, a trick with her, she chose to keep him waiting until nearly 7 o'clock, a delay which brought about in him the deepest dejection of spirit for the time being. For supposing, after all, in the interval, she decided that she did not care for him, and did not wish to see him any more, well, then he would have to do without her, of course, but that would prove that he was not interesting to a girl as pretty as she was, despite all the nice clothes he was now able to wear and the money he could spend. He was determined that, girl or no girl, he would not have one who was not pretty. Ratter and Hegland did not seem to mind whether the girl they knew was attractive or not, but with him it was a passion. The thought of being content with one not so attractive almost nauseated him. And yet here he was now on the street corner in the dark, the flare of many signs and lights about, hundreds of pedestrians hurrying hither and thither, the thought of pleasurable intentions and engagements written upon the faces of many, and he alone, might have to turn and go somewhere else, eat alone, go to a theater alone, go home alone, and then to work again in the morning. He had just about concluded that he was a failure, when out of the crowd, a little distance away, emerged the face and figure of Hortense. She was smartly dressed in a black velvet jacket with a reddish-brown collar and cuffs, and a bulgy round tam of the same material with a red leather buckle on the side, and her cheeks and lips were rouged a little, and her eyes sparkled, and as usual she gave herself all the airs of one very well content with herself. "Oh, hello, I'm late, ain't I? I couldn't help it. You see, I forgot I had another appointment with a fella, a friend of mine. Gee, a peach of a boy, too. And it was only at 6 I remembered that I had the 2 dates. Well, I was in a mess then, so I had to do something about one of you. I was just about to call you up and make a date for another night, only I remembered you wouldn't be at your place after 6. Tom never is, and Charlie always is in his place till 6:30, anyhow, sometimes later, and he's a peach of a fella that way, never grouchy or nothing, and he was going to take me to the theater and to dinner, too. He has charge of the cigar stand over here at the Orphea, so I called him up. Well, he didn't like it so very much, but I told him I'd make it another night. Now, ain't you glad? Don't you think I'm pretty nice to you, disappointing a good-looking fellow like Charlie for you?" She'd caught a glimpse of the disturbed and jealous and yet fearsome look in Clyde's eyes as she talked of another, and the thought of making him jealous was a delight to her. She realized that he was very much smitten with her, so she tossed her head and smiled, falling into step with him as he moved up the street. "You bet it was nice of you to come," he forced himself to say, even though the reference to Charlie as a peach of a fella seemed to affect his throat and his heart at the same time. What chance had he to hold a girl who was so pretty and self-willed? "Gee, you look swell tonight," he went on, forcing himself to talk, and surprising himself a little with his ability to do so. "I like the way that hat looks on you, and your coat, too." He looked directly at her, his eyes lit with admiration, an eager yearning filling them. He would have liked to have kissed her, her pretty mouth, only he did not dare here or anywhere as yet. "I don't wonder you have to turn down engagements. You're pretty enough. Don't you want some roses to wear?" They were passing a flower store at the moment, and the sight of them put the thought of the gift in his mind. He'd heard Heglin say that women liked fellows who did things for them. "Oh, sure, I'd like some roses," she replied, turning into the place. "Or maybe some of those violets. They look pretty. They go better with this jacket, I think." She was pleased to think that Clyde was sporty enough to think of flowers, also that he was saying such nice things about her. At the same time she was convinced that he was a boy who had had little, if anything, to do with girls, and she preferred use in men who were more experienced, not so easily flattered by her, not so easy to hold. Yet she could not help thinking that Clyde was a better type of boy or man than she was accustomed to, more refined, and for that reason, in spite of his gaucheness in her eyes, she was inclined to tolerate him, to see how he would do. "Well, these are pretty nifty," she exclaimed, picking up a rather large bouquet of violets and pinning them on. "I think I'll wear these." And while Clyde paid for them, she posed before the mirror, adjusting them to her taste. At last, being satisfied as to their effect, she turned and exclaimed, "Well, I'm ready," and took him by the arm. Clyde, being not a little overawed by her spirit and mannerisms, was at a loss what else to say for the moment, but he need not have worried. Her chief interest in life was herself. "Gee, I tell you, I had a swift week of it last week, out every night until 3, and Sunday until nearly morning. My, that was some rough party I was to last night, all right. Ever been down to Burkett's at Gifford's Ferry? Oh, a nifty place, all right, right over the Big Blue at 39th. Dancing in summer, and you can skate outside when it's frozen in winter, or dance on the ice. And the niftiest little orchestra." Clyde watched the play of her mouth and the brightness of her eyes and the swiftness of her gestures, without thinking so much of what she said, very little. "Wallace Strone was along with us. Gee, he's a scream of a kid. And afterwards, when we were sitting down to eat ice cream, he went out in the kitchen and blacked up and put on a waiter's apron and coat, and then comes back and serves us. That's one funny boy. And he did all sorts of funny stuff with the dishes and spoons. Clyde sighed, because he was by no means as gifted as the gifted Trone. And then Monday morning, when we all got back, it was nearly 4, and I had to get up again at 7. I was all in. I could have chucked my job, and I would have, only for the nice people down at the store and Mr. Beck. He's the head of my department, you know, and say how I do plague that poor man. I sure am hard on that store. One day I comes in late after lunch. One of the other girls punched the clock for me with my key, see, and he was out in the hall and he saw her, and he says to me afterwards, about 2 in the afternoon, "Say, look here, Miss Briggs." He always calls me Miss Briggs, 'cause I won't let him call me nothing else. He'd try to get fresh if I did. "That loan and that key stuff don't go. Cut that stuff out now. This ain't no follies." I had to laugh. He gets so sore at times at all of us. But I put him in his place just the same. He's kind of soft on me, you know. He wouldn't fire me for worlds, not him, so I says to him, "See here, Mr. Beck, you can't talk to me in any such style as that. I'm not in the habit of coming late often, and what's more, this ain't the only place I can work in K.C. If I can't be late once in a while without hearing about it, you can just send up for my time, that's all, see?" I wasn't going to let him get away with that stuff, and just as I thought, he weakened. All he says was, "Well, just the same, I'm warning you. Next time maybe Mr. Tierney'll see you, and then you'll get a chance to try some other store, all right?" He knew I was bluffing, and that I did too. I had to laugh, and I saw him laughing with Mr. Scott about 2 minutes later. But, gee, I certainly do pull some raw stuff around there at times. This book is continued on cassette number 3, side 1. Please fast forward to the end of this tape.